い全国大会目指して頑張ってみたいかあの若い頃の気持ちを取り戻せたら良いのにもしよろしければ行きましょうか願いが叶う街にその時間楽しい年に行くもしかして知ってるのやのととすがり出会うやなものって答えそうかもしれない知りて素晴らしいものそれは救いの神道だ我々の忘れおいでこれは愛の告白願って忘れましょう成長の苦悩世界を恋になり雨のアウハウと叫んで気合い入れよう願いの願うの今日の今日のベケーション今日
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to kick back, relax, and talk about some anime this week on the show. We bring you the conclusion to the very short Part 4 of Kyoto Vacation. My Ordinary Life is a Mystery to be Lived. Last week we talked about Nichijou, My Ordinary Life, one of the greatest comedy anime of all time. And this week we're talking about a very different show that has absolutely no relationship to Nichijou whatsoever, other than it is the next show that KyoAni made, and it is also incredibly good. Today we are talking about Hyouka, the adaptation of the Classic Literature Club series of mystery novels in Japan, in a very, very excellent classic show that this is now my third time watching it. Every time I've watched it, I loved it even more, and I'm extremely excited to talk about this show today, Jonathan.
Oh, I am too. I think this show is a fucking masterpiece. It's in the top tier KyoAni shelf for me so far, with Haruhi and Clannad and K-On! I think would be my other favorites so far. Mm-hmm. And I actually think while you decided to pair Nichijou and Hyouka more out of circumstance than anything, there were two shows that didn't go anywhere else. They were next to each other. We got to make the My Ordinary Life is a Mystery to be Lived pun, ha ha ha. But I think there is a relationship between these two in that, other than Haruhi, I think these are the two shows that feel the most like nobody but Kyoto Animation could make them. Like, nobody but KyoAni is weird and crazy enough, but also skilled enough at animation to do Nichijou the way they did it, right? Like,
oh yeah,
nobody else is going to do something like Nichijou, I think, in the first place, because it is such a bizarre kind of show that it is, but then also do it with, like, the level of effortfulness that show has. And then I think, frankly, Hyouka might be even more singular, because at the very least with Nichijou, I can say there are other shows that have the rough rhythms of a, yonkama gag manga in anime form, right? That are surreal and weird. Nichijou is particularly singular at that, but I've seen that. Hyouka is, like, generically unclassifiable, because it is sort of a slice of life anime. It is sort of a mystery show, but it's kind of neither of those, because the mystery show, the mystery format that we are all used to, is mysteries that have some kind of intense real-world stakes, like someone has been killed or something has been stolen. And there is a mystery in every episode of Hyouka, but it never has stakes like that. It is always, the stakes are interpersonal curiosity. And so that is a very different kind of mystery. But it then is also not a slice of life show, really, because the mystery means there is just way more plot than you would get in something like even a K-On!, which, near the end becomes, I think, less slice of life-y and more plot heavy. And most of the show, most of Hyouka, it's very novelistic, is people sitting in rooms talking. Mm-hmm. And Kyoto Animation took that and made what I think is the most beautiful animated television show I've ever seen. And I think you put all of that together, and it's like, if I had to point to one show that we've watched so far this season to say, this is the Kyoto Animation effect, this defines what these people are kind of all about, I think Hyouka might be the one. And that's not me saying it's the absolute best, but it might be on that level just the most oh my God, nobody else would touch this source material. And if they did, it wouldn't look like this, you know?
Yeah, and I basically agree that in my mind, Hyouka kind of, even though it's not necessarily the most popular KyoAni show, it's kind of the representative KyoAni show in my mind, and it always has been. Some of that is, I think, this is like the most pure KyoAni aesthetic, like just the way the hair looks, the backgrounds, the clothes, and how they move on the characters, like those kinds of really fiddly details that KyoAni is just so superb at is really heightened here. I think partially because, as you say, like the subject matter, it's so much of having long conversations in rooms and finding ways to express those conversations in ways that is very engaging with the framing, and then also using some of like the abstract stuff that I think is a real product of Takemura Yasuhiro being the director here, and going to some interesting places in terms of how they represent the deductions and stuff, and using visual language to do that. But I also think, yeah, there's a sort of purity to the storytelling and the character writing and the performances, both in terms of voice acting, but also the animated performances of the characters, that to me just sort of no other studio would be able to pull this show off like this. There are other shows that are broadly in this kind of like Nichijou mystery or like daily life mystery kind of thing. But there's nothing that's even close to as good as Hyouka, because I think in order to adapt this material into a visual medium requires so much skill, so much invention on the part of the creators, and finding the places where they can really breathe life into it on something that is such a deeply literary kind of mode. It's phenomenal, because yes, most mystery stories rely upon there to be a certain amount of heightened drama and action with murder mysteries and that kind of stuff that gives an avenue for visual medium to really expand and play in that side of it that like the literary side doesn't have as many tools on. But if you have these very kind of plain, regular, everyday mysteries, that kind of whole field that your visual adaptations for these kinds of genres take, that's taken off the board. And so the ways in which Hyouka expresses the mystery genre is, I think, really fascinating. And as you say, I think is representative of the kind of thing that only really KyoAni as a studio, with the bench of talent that they have and the kind of institutional knowledge and conditions they have in their workplace, could actually pull off.
Yeah. It's a truly remarkable show, and somehow I had never really heard of this one. I had heard of a lot of the other KyoAni shows like Haruhi and Clannad and K.O. and Nichijou, and they all carried a certain reputation with them. And maybe I'm just a bad fake anime fan, but Hyouka was not really on my radar that way, and so I knew nothing about it other than like I had the Blu-ray and I'd seen the cover, and it seemed to be about people in some kind of club. And then I'm like, oh, it's a classic lit club, okay. And then they never cracked a book. And I was, it's just this show totally lies to you. It's the classic literature club. They never read books. And then it turns out to be kind of this mystery show. And so there was also this just kind of beautiful thing of discovery for me. Because it does have some surface level similarities, particularly to Haruhi in the central dynamic of the boy who is detached from the world and the girl who is this kind of whirling dervish. But of course, it is not supernatural in any way. It's very, very grounded. And so it has a very different valence, but it brings in a lot of what I've always loved in Kyoto Animation stuff. And I knew I was in for a treat. I think it is the second episode where Chitanda tells Oreki what she, like, this mystery she has with her uncle. And they're at this cafe, and there's a series of shots that are composed so weird. It's like one is like her head, but it's like almost the chin is cut off. She's at the very bottom of frame to the right, and there's all this dead space. There's one where it's framed under the table with the like side of the table bisecting the entire frame and cutting Oreki's face in half. And then there's one that is like just of her knees under the table with the table taking up the first half of the shot. And I was like, oh, we're back. We're so fucking back. This is like Haruhi shots times 1,000. It is all the like, how do we make conversation weird and disorienting and interesting and engaging? And literally nobody is better at that than these guys. And Hyouka, because of what it's about, that's the whole show. And it's so cool to see that engaged with.
Yes, if you're a fan of that kind of Haruhi style of where they try to sort of actualize the sort of quote unquote virtual camera or whatever in this kind of animated space, in finding camera angles that feel like they're physical, and playing with that, like that. Hyouka takes that and dials it up to 11, and all kinds of interesting stuff they do with like kind of camera based effects, with like different kinds of zooms and lenses, and there's a lot of interesting stuff with depth of field that they just play with that toy in a way that is like so fascinating. And yeah, it is just on a pure kind of filmmaking level. Hyouka is so exceptional. It's the kind of thing where, you know, we've talked about this a couple times over the course of the recording of this podcast, that occasionally you have to sort of jump out of this podcast mode and watch a normal anime and realize it's like, this is how high level Kyoani is, because you watch anything else, even another show that's really good, and you're like, oh my God, like it's not even close to the level of kind of intentionality and purpose and artistry that's going on in every single shot and in every single scene of some of these episodes of Hyouka. And you can watch what are like the best, most popular shows of the whole year, and it's just not even in the same dimension, really. And Hyouka pushes it to an even higher level than most of the other Kyoani stuff we've watched.
I mean, even movies. Hyouka looks better than a lot of animated movies. Like, I was the other night, this is for research in my dissertation. One day I will explain why I was doing this, but I was watching Pokemon, the first movie, the Japanese version of that, from a Blu-ray master, so it looked good. And, you know, that is a very good-looking movie. That is it was a big budget. It was the first big Pokemon movie. It's from 1999. It's all done on film. It's lovely. And I finished that. I was taking notes, and then I went over and watched some Hyouka near the end of the show, and it's just night and day. It's just like, oh my God. And you know, that was a big theatrical motion picture that played around the world in thousands of screens. And Hyouka is just on a different caliber than most of what you will see in animation, film, or TV.
Yeah, and I think it's due to both. There's just an incredibly high level of sort of detail in the production, but it's also it's the direction of it, right? It's the choice of camera angles, it's the use of certain tools that lend a lot of depth to the imagery. That it's not just that they've got like budget or whatever, because they don't even necessarily have a bigger budget than other studios. It's just that they've got people that have so much experience at this point that we have charted. We're coming up on about almost close to 10 years since they started doing their own original anime, especially if you're counting some of like the earlier stuff that we didn't cover, like the OVAs and things like that. That this bench of talent is so deep at this point. And the new people that they're bringing on are also so good, and they're bringing them up to speed so quickly in terms of getting them to the level that everyone else is at. That yes, it is a very special show, Hyouka. So
yeah. And those scenes I mentioned earlier, by the way, were from episode 3, not episode 2. I do apologize. That is an Ishidate Taichi episode, and it looks good. But they all do. Well, so
yes, I mean, to be fair, the scene you're talking about starts at the end of episode 2, and then it extends on to the beginning of episode 3. But episode 3 is where the shots you were talking about are from.
Yes.
All right, so let's get into the history of this, because there's some interesting stuff here. Unfortunately, I really wanted to try to find the visual fan book for this one, but I couldn't find any scans online. I'm realizing how lucky I was on like Clannad and Haruhi Season 1 to be able to find those, because unfortunately they're just not readily available, which just sucks, because people in Japan, I don't know if anyone's listening to this podcast, but go buy those and scan them and put them online for free, please. They're like fascinating resources, and it's frustrating that they're very hard to access if you don't live in Japan and can't easily get them used from Japanese stores. But
right, that's because I was going to say, we could, if you lived in Japan, you could get a used copy pretty easily. But here it's like you'd have to go to like Yahoo Auctions Japan, and you'd have to use a proxy seller and get them here and all of that. And it's just because they're not in print anymore. Obviously, they're because they were basically like MOOCs. They're magazine book style things. Yeah,
and it would take weeks and weeks and weeks to get them, and you'd have to pay so much to ship them. Yeah, it's like it's a lot, but there is still lots of interesting information I was able to find online. So let's break down some of what we're talking about here in terms of the background. So obviously, the place to start is to talk about the books, because this is based on a series of novels. So the author, Yonezawa Honobu, who wrote this series, had always had an interest in writing, and wrote I thought this was an interesting detail, he wrote a fanfic of War of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells book, at 11, which when an 11-year-old kid, when an 11-year-old kid writes a piece of fanfic for a Victorian era sci-fi novel, you know that like this kid's going to go places in terms of writing. And then he started writing original stories in middle school, and then he began self-publishing his writing online on his own fan site called Hanmuden in the 90s, which is when he started attending college. So kind of like similar to Nasu in a way. Like it reminds me a lot of like Hinoko Nasu from Type Moon, had a similar kind of like history. When he graduated from university, he began pursuing his dream of being a novelist, and specifically, he was inspired by a lot of mystery novels, and we'll touch on this in a second. But specifically, there was a mystery novel called Flying Horse, another one called Princess and Dokunomiya. They're both written by an author named Kitamura Kaoru, and I'm going to touch on those again later, but those are kind of some of his inspirations. He began releasing a short version of what would eventually become his debut novel, Hyouka, on his website, and then eventually he edited that together into a longer, more complete version, and then submitted it to a young mystery and horror section of the 5th Kadokawa School Novel Awards and won the contest. So there was a Kadokawa 1 contest for mystery and horror and kind of new authors, and he submitted the original version of Hyouka and won. In 2001, Hyouka was published under the Kadokawa Sneaker Mystery Club label, and people might remember that this is the same magazine that published the Haruhi series, was Kadokawa Sneaker. The novel proved popular and then spawned a series that is called the Classic Literature Club series. So if you're looking up the books, Hyouka is just the title of the original novel. The series is called Classic Literature Club, which always is kind of confusing when you're looking around online if you just think of it as Hyouka, because that's what the anime is called. Which obviously Classic Literature Club series would have made for a very dull name for an anime, so they're smart to just say Hyouka and leave it at that.
Well, and also just for reference, people will usually write it just as kotenbu, the Japanese.
Yes.
It's the kind of phrase you can say faster in Japanese, which is why it doesn't sound as awkward as saying Classic Literature Club in English.
Yes.
Is a terrible name for a series. The kotenbu series sounds fine, but I think they made the right choice calling the show Hyouka. It is much more distinctive.
Yes. So the sequel, the second novel called The Credits Roll of the Fool, that was released in 2002 under the same label. But shortly after the release of the second novel, that label, the Sneaker Mystery Club one, was discontinued. And so the next novel that he was planning, that he was in the process of writing, had lost its home. What was to originally have been the third, and he had planned it on being the final classic literature series novel, was then eventually picked up by the publisher Tokyo Sogensha, and he re-edited that into a non-classic literature series book called Sayonara Yosei that then spawned its own other series, because basically, Kadokawa had the rights to using those characters, so he couldn't use them. In 2005, Yonezawa published the third Classic Literature Club novel under the regular Kadokawa Shoten label, and the previous books were then re-released under that label. And Kadokawa Shoten is just kind of Kadokawa's primary novel label. He then wanted to publish a fourth novel, which was a collection of short stories that had been published in various magazines in 2007. And then he had a fifth novel, which is a full novel-length story, that one which is not adapted into the anime at all. Then there is a sixth and currently final novel, which is another short story collection. That one was released in 2016. During this time, Yonezawa has published many other novels, mostly mystery, under a whole range of different series, and he's like a hugely prolific author. Like, he has written, in proper mystery novel writer fashion, he has written just an absurd number of books, you gotta, if you're a good old school mystery writer, you've just gotta write like a book a year. That's just the way it works. And he continues to be extremely successful. He's got won all these different kinds of awards. It's made me very interested in reading his books at some point once I finish the Haruhi stuff, because it seems very, very good. But let's touch a little bit on genre, because this was something I didn't know a lot about, and I found it pretty interesting. So the Classic Literature Club series is an example of the Nichijo no Nazo, or daily life, or Nichijo no Nazo, daily life mystery, subgenre of Japanese mystery fiction. This subgenre typically features characters solving a mystery set in a casual setting, with the characters being regular people rather than police or private detectives, and the mysteries revolve around strange occurrences in daily life rather than crimes, like the more typical murder mystery, right? So this is, that should sound very familiar. If you watched Hyouka, it fits all of those kinds of patterns. The other thing is these stories specifically follow classic mystery telling or storytelling tropes, modeled after writers like Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, which is why there's a lot of Christie references and other early 20th century mystery novel references in Hyouka. The subgenre came about during a renaissance in Japanese mystery fiction that began in the late 80s. That's called the Shin Honkaku mystery movement. Shin Honkaku basically means a revival of the kind of classic mystery. Honkaku is proper or classic kind of meaning. Shin is a revival or renewal. And so this was a whole movement of different short stories and novels written by authors that were inspired by moving back to the tropes of the early 20th century style mystery novels like Agatha Christie and making mysteries like that. This is also would have been like around the time that things like Columbo caught on big and has been super big in Japan. Like Japan has always been very interested in mystery stories around this time. So it makes sense that they kind of gone back to this. And that's what serves as a basis for what inspires Hyouka. In 1989, during the heart of this renaissance, the author Kitamura Kaoru is typically cited as the originator of the daily life mystery subgenre. And he started that with the short story Sora Tobu Uma, or Flying Horse, which was 1989. That's the one I talked about earlier that Yonezawa has specifically cited as an example of one of his main inspirations. Another point on genre that I found was pretty interesting is when you think about, are these books light novels or are they novel novels?
I wanted to talk about this too, because I think it's interesting and important for why this show looks the way it does.
Yes, because it's pretty fascinating. So under its original publication through the Kadokawa sneaker label, at the time they were basically considered to be light novels because that was a light novel publishing house. But there is one important distinction there, which is that these books have never had, as far as I can tell, maybe there's like an edition that did this, but the original version certainly did not have illustrations, which is a thing you expect. If people have never read a light novel, light novels have illustrations, a couple of illustrations throughout the book, and obviously a cover as well that are drawn by their illustrator. For instance, Suzumiya Haruhi, that was Noisy Ito, was the illustrator, and so all the character designs and stuff fundamentally come from Noisy Ito and then are reinterpreted by the staff at KyoAni when they make their anime. That is not the case with Hyouka. There were no illustrations. All the character designs are original to this show, designed by Nishio Futoshi. When the series was switched from this Kadokawa sneaker label to the Kadokawa Shoten label in 2005, that is at the point at which nobody really considers them or talks about them as light novels, and now they're just categorized generally with other quote-unquote regular novels. So if you look them up on like the Bookwalker website, which I use sometimes to read Japanese books, or like Japanese Amazon, it's not put in the light novel section, it's just put into other regular mystery novel sections, and it's sort of just categorized in that way. But I find it kind of interesting that it was always kind of on this line where it was technically published by a light novel label, but it was a light novel label that wasn't successful, I think because the genres and the kind of writing it attracted wasn't really light novel-esque, and so that eventually it was just kind of picked up by a more standard publishing label and just recategorized, and nobody's kind of looked back and just said, hey, no, this is it. It's just a novel.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand because this is a novel series, because it does not have illustrations. All the art is original to the show. Like, you will not see, in Haruhi, Noisy Ito is credited in the opening theme song, and then there's also the show's character designer credited as well. But there are those original designs they're pulling from. And because there are no original designs, you said earlier, Sean, that like when you think of like the KyoAni aesthetic, you think of this show. And I think it's because it is just the people at KyoAni. It is Futoshi Nishio who has, had an impact already on this, on the shows we talked about on this podcast from the ground up, talking, working through these character designs. And so it feels like everything is very bespoke to what KyoAni likes to do, and they're not pulling from anyone else's art. And that is an interesting thing, because that's pretty rare in anime to not have any kind of pre-existing character designs, be it from a manga or a video game or a light novel or something. Everything we've talked about so far has had something pre-existing, right?
Yeah, and especially if you're making an adaptation of something but not getting character designs from it, that's very weird. Because, yes, it's either you have a totally original production, at which point, obviously, you're just creating your own character designs, or you're adapting a source material, and basically anything else you would adapt would give you character designs. And it's pretty rare that you would get something like this that is adapted from a novel. It's certainly not unheard of in the anime world, but it's pretty uncommon overall. And it's often stuff like this. It'll be something like Welcome to the NHK, which is a book that is like on the border as like where some people kind of consider it light novel, some people don't. And, this one, it's interesting the way in which that stuff is classified. And I went down a big rabbit hole, just sort of like Googling and learning that Japanese people have no idea what the distinction is meant to be. Like, there are things that, like, very clearly, yes, this is clearly a light novel. There's lots of stuff where it's like, nobody's going to think that Wagahai wa Neko de Aru by Natsume Soseki is going to be, which is like a classic 20th century Japanese novel. Nobody's going to put that in light novel camp. But there's a huge category of books where people are like, it's kind of like YA fiction over here or something, where you're like, is this young adult? Is it a children's book? Is it just a book? What the fuck is this? And it's kind of interesting to look at a different culture grappling with those exact same questions, just in a slightly different way.
Well, because in terms of format, the Kotenbu books are identical to something like Haruhi, or even like Sword Art Online, that you have full story volumes, and then you have volumes that are composed of short stories that come together. You know, that's just how these things work. So, like, in effect, does it really make a difference other than the presence of illustrations and maybe the price and size of the book and where it is in the bookstore? Not really, right?
Yes. But there will be lots of nerds online like us that will debate endlessly about which categorization it falls into. And then, you know, years later, some random American dude just stumbles into it. He's like, what the fuck are all these people talking about?
Awesome.
Yes. So let's then talk about a little bit about the anime. Again, I don't have a lot of like big behind the scenes stuff about the anime I could find, but there's some basic stuff here. So KyoAni adapted the Literature Club novels in 2012, and they took, as we talked about, the title Hyouka, just from the original book, as the title for the series. They aired 22 episodes from April to September 2012, with the one OVA, which we'll talk about in a second. The series adapts the first 3 novels, which are Hyouka, Credits Roll the Fool, and the Kuryavska sequence, along with short stories that were then collected in the 4th volume, The Doll That Took a Detour. And then there's one story, episode 18, that was published originally in magazine form in 2008. But that one, this is the one about the teacher that in the helicopters. That story was not actually collected in a proper volume until 2016's, even though I'm told I now have wings, which I thought was interesting. The series, the anime series, does not adapt the 5th novel, which was published in 2010, called Approximating the Distance Between Two Peoples, and that novel has the main characters in their 2nd year of high school, which is one of the reasons why I suspect they didn't adapt it, even though if they didn't do as many of the short stories, there would be space for them to do another full novel-length story, but it very clearly they want the show to take place over the course of 1 year, and I think they were smart in sort of how they designed the season. The stories, they were ordered in chronological order, and then they use periods from the Chinese lunar solar calendar as eye catches. So the eye catches that have like the 2 kanji characters, those are references to this Chinese calendar where each month is like split into 3 sections or whatever. The series starts on the Seimei period, which is quote unquote 15 degrees, which is early April, and then it ends on Shunbun, 0 degrees, which is March 21st, the spring equinox, right? So it's which is also a Japanese school year, right? So the school year starts in April, it ends in March, and so that's kind of how they shape that. The series is generally faithful to the novels. From what I understand, I didn't read all the novels, but I didn't find anything online that indicated they kind of went off the reservation anywhere. The big change or adjustment they make is that they change the setting and update it to being in 2012 as opposed to 2000, which is when the original novels are. And so there are lots of little tiny things that follow from that. So obviously, like Hatsune Miku being one of the cosplayed characters is not what it would have been because she was not invented yet when that novel came out, you know. So there's little tiny things like that, but the plots and all of that fall from what the books did. The series received a lot of critical acclaim, especially for its visuals, for very obvious reasons, and it did sell well, but it was not like a titanic, seismic, industry-shifting thing like Haruhi or Keion that made people reconsider like what success looks like for a late-night anime. But the show sold respectably well. It sold in the range of 8,000 to 10,000 volumes for each release, which is, again, not like a titanic success, but it was still one of the best-selling anime of the seasons in which it aired. The series had a promotional radio show, as we're very used to, featuring the voice actors. That ran for 36 episodes. They had 2 drama CDs. There is also a manga adaptation which coincided with the release of the series, and that manga adaptation uses Futoshi Nishi's character design. So it's kind of was promotional for the TV series, but it has kept going on. So the manga is still releasing new volumes. It is currently adapting material that is past what the anime is doing, some of the stuff from that 5th novel. And then coincidentally, this has nothing to do with the KyoAni show, but there is also a live-action adaptation of Hyouka that was made in 2017 that seems like it's maybe okay. The people seem to like it fine.
That just seems like the kind of thing where, like, obviously you could, and maybe your first instinct even would be to say this story could be live action, but having seen it in animation, I would never want to watch that movie because I feel like no matter how good it is, there's just no way the characters can be as detailed and interesting and like soulful as they are in how they are drawn here, because it is such a masterpiece of animation, and every little intricacy, down to all these intricacies that just like literally cannot exist in live action.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where, like, if the anime didn't exist,
Yes.
it would make perfect sense to do a live action version. I just wouldn't want to be someone that would have to make a thing that would be compared to this anime.
That's my point.
Like,
Yes. Yeah.
Just like once they've already done it, it's like, well, fuck. I'm not gonna.
This isn't
do that.
Lupin the Third, where like a live action adaptation is just a weird idea to begin with, right? It's a totally normal idea, except that the anime exists. It would be like doing a live action Clannad today. Like, could you do it? Kind of. Would you want to when the KyoAni show exists? Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is also the OVA episode, which I found this pretty interesting, because I was always confused about this OVA, because the OVA so clearly is set between the two episodes, but I kind of didn't understand how it was released. So I did a little bit of research. So the OVA was originally broadcast as an online free broadcast on Ustream on July 8th, 2012, which is when the 13th episode also aired, right? And so the OVA takes place between episodes 12 and episode 13. And so in real time, if you're watching at the time and you were up on things and you knew this broadcast was there, you would have been able to watch that, and then later that day, watch episode 13 live on TV. But afterwards, the OVA was released for what, as I understand it, was designed to be, which is a special bonus that was part of the third volume of that manga adaptation. So that's like, if you wanted the physical thing, that's how you got it. Which, again, this is kind of standard of how OVAs are treated these days, as they come packaged with manga or light novel, like special editions. The OVA is the only episode in the anime that is not based on one of the original stories, but the storyline was outlined by the author Yonezawa. So he didn't write the script for the episode, but he created kind of like the story that was going to have. And then I thought this was interesting, because this like just happened. Yonezawa adapted that story treatment into a literary form, so made a short story of it and included that in an omnibus collection of the first half of the novels in the short stories, which released last March, so March 2023. So that like just happened. If you want to read By the Poolside, which is what it's called in literature form, you can go get that omnibus version. And I thought that's just crazy coincidence that we just happen to be doing this podcast, and there's still new kind of new classic literature stuff coming out. I mean, Yonezawa has clearly moved on from this series for a long time, but he made a couple of little extra bonuses for this new omnibus release.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. And it is one of the weirder OVAs we've talked about, because like K-On! Has OVAs that can slot into the story, but you wouldn't necessarily want to watch them there because they adopt a very different perspective and point of view, and like are clearly outside of the perspective of the show at large, or how it is presented in sequence. But like it's just episode 11.5. It's just, that's how Funimation presents it on the Blu-ray, is they just call it 11.5 and put it in there. And you would never know if you didn't know it was technically classified as an OVA, although really it should be classified as an ONA, because that's how it came out.
That was my thought as well. This is, if we want to be anal about our definitions, that's another one you could be. But yes, I mean, I remember when I originally watched the show, which I think was streaming on Crunchyroll, it didn't have the OVA. And so I like watched the show and then saw there was an OVA, and I was like, oh, cool. And I looked it up and found a copy online and then watched it. And if it's like fine watching out of sequence, it's still enjoyable, but it feels really weird, because it does just feel like you found a random episode you missed and just watched it a week later. So yes, it's just kind of a weird thing that is not just part of the show, especially because the show is 22 episodes. It's 23 if you add the OVA. That's like still not even quite a full 2 cores. So it's just kind of a strange thing that OVA. It's a mystery to me why it's treated that way. But let's talk about the crew. So we've got director here is Takemoto Yasuhiro, whom we have not seen in the main director role, or like the solo main director role, since Lucky Star. Series composition is Gato Shoji, who is the writer of the Full Metal Panic books, who's been on all kinds of KyoAni stuff, right? He's written a lot of episodes so far. Now he's doing the full adaptation of the books here. Character design and chief animation director is Futoshi Nishia, whom we originally talked about him in season 2 of Haruhi, where I talked about on one of the Endless 8 episodes that when his episode that he was the animation director for that specific episode came up, I looked at it, it was like, oh, those are just characters in Hyouka. And I looked at it, it was like, oh yeah, he's the Hyouka guy. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. The composer here, one of our most favoritist composers for this kind of media, it is Tanaka Kohei, whom we've talked about before when we talked about Mobile Fighter G Gundam. He is also the composer of One Piece. He is the composer for the Gravity Rush games, also the Sakura Wars games, if you know those, as well as like a shit ton of other stuff. But those are the things that jump out to me when I think of him. The music we'll talk about is just incredible.
It's so good.
Always.
I love that Kohei Tanaka has fucking One Piece under his belt, and he is still like tremendously like prolific on the side. You know, he's got this 1,000 episode weekly airing. I know he doesn't like compose new music every week, but it is still like a big job. And it's just like that has not slowed him down at all. Plenty of other stuff going on, including this show.
It's so good.
So good.
In terms of episode directors, we've got our usual cast of just incredibly talented, crazy people. So we've got Takemoto Yasuhiro. He directs episode 1 and the finale 22. The 22 is co-directed with Ishidate Taichi. Takemoto did the storyboards for the last episode. He also did the storyboards for episode 2. Utsumi Hiroko, whom who we best now know for the person who kind of creates the Free series. She did 4 episodes, 2, 7, 15, 21. Her episodes are all incredibly good, especially 2 and 21 are just fantastic. Ishidate Taichi, he did episodes 3, 17, and he did some of the work on episode 22. Kawanami Eisaku did episodes 4 and 11. Our boy Kigami Yoshiji is there for episode 5, which is the climax of the Hyouka arc, which is an appropriately big episode to give to him. And the first scene of that episode is just like one of the best scenes in any anime ever. It's fucking crazy. Sakamoto Kazuya is here. He does episodes 6, 10, and 16. And one of those, I think it's episode 10. Episode 10, that's one of my favorite episodes of the whole series. I think that's the best thing he's done. And he's done some great episodes. But episode 10, which is the big episode where Oreki thinks he solves the mystery of the video. And that episode's fucking incredible. We've got Kitanohara Noriyuki delivering 3 incredible fucking episodes, 8, 13, and especially 18, which might be my favorite episode of the whole fucking show. Episode 18 is just amazing. Yamada Naoko is here with episodes 9 and 14, both also incredible and very Yamada Naoko episodes, and we'll talk about those. And then we've got some newcomers here. So Ogawa Taichi directed episodes 12 and 19. These are Ogawa's first episodes that he directed. He started at KyoAni as an animator on Clannad, and then he becomes a regular episode director past this point, so we'll see his name pop up a lot. And then we have Otarika, who she directed the OVA, so 11.5, and episode 20. That's the one where they're Oreki and Chitanda get locked in the warehouse together. So these are Oda's first episodes that she directed. She started on In-Betweens on Clannad, and then a little bit after the Beyond the Boundary series finished, she left KyoAni, and she's done a lot of work for the Kyoto branch of Leiden Films. She's still over there and doing a lot of, she's very prolific over there, which makes sense because that's also obviously in the another neighboring Kyoto animation studio. So lots of really great returning directors, some people that we've seen a few times now, like Utsumi Hiroko. I think you can see how much she has kind of grown because her episodes are amazing. And then we've got a couple of newcomers also doing some really great stuff here.
What was Tatsuya Ishihara up to right now? Is he working on
Love Chinibyo and Other Delusions?
Okay.
That's what he'd be moving on to, because he's
like the one name missing that you would expect to see. And I just was like, did that air close enough? And that's also a 2012 show. So yes. We'll be talking about that next week or next time on the show. And that's Tatsuya Ishihara. Okay. I'm always curious when there's sometimes you'll see the one person missing and you're like, they must be making the next show we're watching. Yes. Otherwise sometimes they are there anyway. Like Naoko Yamada did all the episodes of Clannad despite that she was right on the verge of directing K-On! And all of that. So sometimes they overlap anyway. But no, it's an incredible group of directors. And this was one where I really kept getting to the end of episodes and going, I bet that was this person, and then I would be correct. And I think it was with Yamada Naoko, I think it's 14 is the one with the cooking contest.
Yes.
And I went, this has to be right. And then her name showed up. I'm like, yep, that was her. Okay. And then the big one was at the end of episode 18, which is the helicopter one. There's this long sequence that the recurring visual motif is that you have Chitanda and Hotaro standing at a crosswalk, and we keep cutting to the go sign, the stoplight for the
pedestrian crosswalk thing. Yeah.
which in Japan has this is a common thing in Japan where it's got this like gauge that goes from like red to green to show you how long you have to wait, and it keeps cutting to that, and I went, this has to be Kitanohara Noriyuki. This has to be. This is just so, that is such a directorial signature of his stuff, and then it absolutely was, and I like cheered because I was so happy.
Yeah, for me, it's particularly that Yamada Naoka is 2 episodes, because episode 9 is the episode where they hear all of the different theories of the other people from the video.
Yes.
So it's an entire episode just set in that one room, hearing all the ideas from the other people. And then, yes, then it's the cooking club one, which both of those are like, if... Like you could like rewrite them as like weird K-On! Plots and they would totally fit. Like there's something about it that the way she handles those episodes just feel at the end. You're just like, I don't even need to look up the credits to write in my notes that was one of the Yamada Naoka ones.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's so, and it is fun because like we're in a very concentrated burst of Kyoto Animation making this podcast, so we're very in on all of this stuff, but it is just so fun because, as you say, we've watched about 10 years of their content almost at this point. Mm-hmm. And as you go through, you just, because these people stay and they're there on every show, you just start to get a feeling for some of those rhythms, and that's part of the fun, I think, and also obviously part of why it is all as good as it is.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the music? This is your next piece of your notes. Just talk about that really quick before we move on.
So obviously, Tanaka Kohei, just one of the all-time greats. One of the other notable things about the soundtrack, though, is that it does incorporate lots of pieces of classical music, like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonatas in there, Bach's Air on the G string is in there. And from what I read, that use of classical pieces was from the suggestion of the author Yonezawa, because that's how he kind of envisioned the tone of the series, which makes sense. One thing I want to shout out, though, in particular, is my favorite song of the soundtrack, which is the song Yuragi o Tomonao Demonstration, which is the deduction song. So whenever Oreki at the end of a story starts to lay out his big deduction, they play this just incredible track, which you can always tell when the track starts because it's the only track, I believe, on the entire soundtrack that notably uses electric guitar. Because the soundtrack is mostly lots of piano, lots of big string, and kind of like sweeping string instruments, to fit in with the classical theme. And then you have some folksier stuff that uses accordion, which is really great and very distinctive. And so there's almost no kind of like rock or popish instruments, but there's this one track that just as soon as it come on, you get this electric guitar go doodle-doo, doodle-doo, and you just know you're in for the shit as soon as that starts. And then he starts laying out his deduction. It eventually like morphs into this whole like Ennio Morricone-esque like Ecstasy of the Gold style, big sweeping piece of music with this rising string section that's accompanied by these female vocals, and underneath that is the guitar still playing, which is just a Morricone-esque in terms of the sound. It's amazing. And then once you come to the end and he's kind of laid out his whole big deduction, it's like a 2-minute piece of music. That original guitar riff comes back in. It goes diddly-down, 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 diddly-down. And as soon as it hits that like resolution note, the piano comes in on like the super, super low piano notes, just like that crunchy, just like it gets under your skin kind of super, super low piano. And it's just the best piece of music. I fucking adore it so much.
It's tremendous. The whole soundtrack is, though, and like Kohei Tanaka is such a master of instrumentation, and this is true in all the work he's done. We talked about it a lot when we reviewed the Gravity Rush games, just how inventive and like it takes such a global perspective on what instruments he draws from. This is something that is so fun on the One Piece score. Like when you get to Wano in One Piece, he starts going back to all these like old Japanese instruments and using a lot of taiko drums and all of this cool stuff. And then here, as you say, it's a more kind of limited palette, but a very precise one. And I love that you get some of the accordion. I love the kind of classical touches. Really, the thing is, I very much think of this as kind of a sister soundtrack to what Haruhi is doing, because there's a lot of similarities in general. And this show has a lot of similarities to Haruhi overall. It is like a weird kind of mirror world inverse of what that show is doing in a lot of ways. And like you can imagine this kind of as an alternate soundtrack to Haruhi, where there's a little less mayhem, and so you don't have those tracks. But like Haruhi also did some of the classical pieces integrated, particularly in the movie, and it has some of that same kind of variety. And I like hearing that. It's kind of a preview into like, what if Kohei Tanaka had been the person who did Haruhi? What would that sound like? I think you get that a little bit here, but it is also also very specific to the show as it exists. I also love whenever they start talking about the mystery, you get that part that's like, I think you talked about it, the like da-da-da-da, da-da-da, the like little like chimes that go off, which I swear to God, every time it's a sound from Pokemon. It's in the Pokemon games. It's when you see the legendary Pokemon, it's like the da-da-da-da-da-da, that whole thing. And it distracted me every time it came up because I associate that whatever that sound was, it sounds like something from the Pokemon games. And I swear it's not because I have Pokemon on the brain. It's just something I heard from the first episode on. But the entire soundtrack is outstanding.
Yeah, it's incredibly good. We also have our opening and ending themes. So we've got two openings. We've got opening 1, Yasashisa no Ryu by Chocho, which is probably my favorite of the two openings. I particularly like there's an acoustic guitar part at the very beginning with this just very classic guitar descending bass line where they do an arpeggio version of the chords, and then on the low string they drop it down one note to transition to the next chord. Like a million songs do this trick, but it always sounds really good, and it sounds particularly good here. I really like that song a lot. And then we also have opening 2, which is Unfinished Stride by Saori Kodama, which is also good. Although that's kind of like with your Pokemon thing. The beginning of that song sounds so much like a Hatsune Miku song. The rest of it doesn't. It's only like the little opening kind of digital bit that is so Hatsune Miku-esque. And it sounds like, I think it's the song Ai Kotoba. I might be misremembering which song it is. But it is... It's good, but it's very distracting to me because I played that song a lot in the game.
Yeah, I agree. I like the song more for opening 1, and I like the animation for both. But I think the second set of animations, ending and or opening 2 and ending 2, are both like some of the best opening and ending animations I've ever seen. And I think for the second one in particular, the Unfinished Stride animation, the like visual story it tells, and it's like a dream sequence of Hotaro going through the school as like a ghost and no one can see him, and then he gets to the Kotenbu Club room, or I guess it's the Earth Science Preparation room that the Kotenbu Club uses, and he's there, and then Chitanda sees him and pulls him out. That is just a beautiful, masterful piece of visual storytelling. And then, of course, ending to the big, like, Holmesian mystery with the girls versus the boys is one of the best things about this entire fucking show. It's just, those are like two great 90-second short animated films on their own that just happen to play every week.
Yes. Oh, I absolutely agree that the animation for opening 2 is just incredible because it is just like a little kind of animated encapsulation of like the story, rather than being opening 1, which is really good and gorgeous and has particularly, there's a very iconic shot to me in that of the camera sweeping around behind Oreki as he's standing in Tantra's heart from the Mugen Train movie. Every time I see just like the big blue sky that's the whole frame, it just makes me think of that now. But
that's in our opening theme, as I used that there because it's such a good shot.
Yes, but I like the opening 2 takes the approach of let's tell a little kind of symbolic story of having him be trapped in like the reflections and he's like on the whiteboard and stuff like that. It's very good. But yes, the ending themes, you've got 2 endings, Marunomi no Yakusoku and Kimi no Matsuwaru Mystery, both of which are sung by the actresses that play Chitanda and Mayaka, Satomi Sato and Kayano Ai. And the first one is composed by Okamoto Kensuke, and the second one, I thought this was interesting, is composed by Takeda Kyo, who's one of like the big composers for the Love Live School Idol Project franchise. So, and I think overall ending 2 is definitely my preferred one, both in terms of the song and the animation. I like ending 1 fine. Ending 1 kind of confuses me though, because I don't really understand what its connection or relationship is to the show. Like, it feels like they had like a half-done K-On! Ending, and they just decided to sort of turn it into a Hyouka ending and finish it. It's just very weird. It's confusing to me.
It does absolutely feel like Naoko Yamada like had a half-finished storyboard and like dusted it off and like gave it to them. That is absolutely, because it does feel like one of the closing songs from K-On! I will say, of the 4 songs, ending 1 is my favorite just to listen to. I really like that song. I think it's a good song. I think it has less to do with Hyouka than any of the songs. So, like, put that aside. Yes. I think ending 2, though, is like 90 of the best seconds of Hyouka, because that song is so good, and then you mix it with this just incredible and so funny and light on its feet animation where they are trying to arrest the boys, and the boys are getting away, and of course the girls are dressed up like Sherlock Holmes characters. The boys are dressed up like, sort of Arsène Lupin proper, not Lupin the Third, and you have all of that stuff. And at the end, you've got the cold case thing over the 2 wanted posters. Yes. The whole thing, it's glorious. It's such a good 90 seconds of animation.
Yes, so very, very good opening and ending themes for sure.
Yeah.
Japanimation Station.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description. And remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show.
Very good everything, Sean. This is Hyouka.
Yes.
This is as like consistently, brilliantly produced a show as you will ever see, and it would be more surprising if we hadn't also seen things like Clannad and K-On! That are also so consistently brilliant from moment to moment, or Nichijou or whatever. We could name a lot of shows here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's phenomenally good. So how do you want to go about breaking down the show, Jonathan?
Well, let's talk about any more kind of general thoughts we have. And then I think we just need to take it in order and take the three big story arcs and then take the individual stories that we get through to the end. You know, one thing I really love about this show is that it does that mixing of arcs in that you have your three sort of novel stories that are kind of reminiscent of, like, you know, how Haruhi is structured with your, like, 6 episodes for Melancholy, 5 episodes for Sigh, that sort of thing. And you have 3 of those. And to me, they just kind of got better and better. Like, I like the Hyouka one a lot. I love it. And then the like video mystery one, I think, is one of the most brilliant concepts for a story I've ever fucking seen. And it tickled me particularly, maybe just as a film person. And then the third one, I think, is 6 of the best episodes of anime ever produced. I think it's the best school festival anime arc I've ever seen. I think it's like as good as literally anything we've watched this season. I would put it on par with. I would put it on par with Endless Eight. I would put it on par with Disappearance. It's all up there. And then I do love, though, that there are the one-offs in there. It's kind of like, this is how you should make a fucking Sherlock Holmes show if you were going to do it, is have the novels and have the short stories and kind of go back and forth. And it's a very smart way to structure the show. And I think the show makes the absolute brilliant choice to end on a set of short story adaptations and end on this sense of daily life moving on and, like, getting the characters resolved, then ending in a plot heavy point. And I think this is a thing that I think a lot of anime actually make a mistake on, is feeling, and American TV too, all kinds of TV, feeling like you have to open and end on plot in a big way, when absolutely not. I actually think you kind of want to end in some kind of denouement space that is outside the plot. Haruhi is really good at this, with, like, Someday in the Rain being the ending, depending on what order you're watching it in. You know, KyoAni has done it with some other shows as well. But I think we even talked about this with on the Weekly Stuff podcast a couple weeks ago. We were talking about Spy Family, and that I really like that season 2 of Spy Family, despite having more narrative serialization than season 1, still decides to open and end on one-off comedy episodes, because that is kind of the heart of the show. And I think Hyouka does a similar thing, where, like, episode 1 is getting into the Hyouka plot, but we're not really there yet. And I like that, you know, by the episode 22, you are still in kind of a one-off. And I think that structure is really key to why this show works as well as it does.
Yeah, it's one of the most interesting things about the show to me, because, like, I can't really think of anything else structured like this other than if you do Haruhi in chronological order, which is like which is a weird thing, right? And particularly, like, Haruhi season 1 in chronological order even more has that kind of feel. If all you did was the first 6 Melancholy episodes and strung those together and then just did all the one-offs, that's a little bit closer to the kind of proportional thing that's going on here.
Yes.
Because, yeah, the whole series, it ends with a long string of one-off episodes. From episode 18 to episode 22 is all one-offs. And it's pretty interesting just structurally to do that, especially when you consider that they had a whole other novel. Like, they could have adapted it. That novel came out 2 years prior to the show releasing. So they very well could have decided to do that last novel that was set when they were second years in high school. And I feel like that's what any other adaptation would have chosen to do. Any other adaptation would have decided, let's maybe pick 1 or 2 of the most important one-off stories to handle. Maybe like the episode 22, the one that this one uses as its finale, and probably the Valentine one, feel like really, really important to the overall plot and kind of character development. But they could have probably shaved off the other ones and been fine. and fit in this big other last storyline. Now, I haven't read that book, so maybe there's something about that would make that particularly untenable and was a reason why KyoAni did it. I don't know. But it feels like KyoAni was really smart in saying, you know what? We're good. We're going to do 22 episodes, even though that's not a full 2 cours. Like, 22 episodes is a weird episode count. Even if you throw the OVA in there and make it 23, it's still 1 episode short of what you would normally expect it to be in terms of length. At least you would expect it to be between 24 to 26 episodes long. And so they go a little bit shorter, and they decide to end with a long string of one-offs just to allow you to sort of like decompress, spend some time with the characters, and it helps the series recenter and refocus itself on the core relationship between Oreki and Chitanda, which is, important throughout the other arcs, but is easy for it to get lost in the mix when there's a big multi-episode mystery to be solved, and instead these little bite-sized episodes really let them to focus and zoom in on those character relationships. And yeah, it's one of my favorite things about the show, and most striking things about the show is that it is structured unlike a normal episode or season of anime, and it's very canny in how it goes about it and choosing to end very much in a quiet space and extend that quiet space out for multiple episodes.
Yeah, and I just think this is the kind of choice we've seen KyoAni make a couple of times, where there is more source material, but they felt their story ended here. And we've seen that on Haruhi. To some degree, we've seen that on K-On! And I think they just are very, very smart in saying, this is where our story ends, and this is the best structure for a season of television, which is what we make. This, company pretty rarely comes back and does, follow-ups and that sort of thing. And I think Hyouka would be, even if there was enough source material, it would be kind of hard to do a season 2 with, because it's such a weird chemistry of things coming together. But yeah, I think structurally it's very smart. I think that variety also is really key in terms of going from arcs to short stories. Again, within the mystery genre, that's how Agatha Christie wrote. That's how, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. That's how a lot of mystery writers write, is you have your novels and you have your short stories. And I think that blend is very important, clearly, here as well. They've done their homework on that. And then I think we also just, Sean, have to pay some attention to the art. Like,
oh yeah,
this is the most impressive piece of TV animation I've ever seen, and its only competition is Clannad and K-On! And Nichijou, right? Like, those are all up there too. But I do think, I think you bring in just the sheer detail of the backgrounds. Like, the backgrounds in Hyouka look like movie backgrounds. They look like Studio Ghibli backgrounds. They look like backgrounds from Makoto Shinkai movies, just like the kind of hyper-detailed, lush, lavish background work with like the brushstrokes fully intact, and just this, all of them could be paintings hung on the walls. You absolutely get that kind of feel from them. And the backgrounds have been lovely in everything we've watched so far, but I do think this is like just an obvious, it's a difference in style also. Like, Nichijou intentionally uses very light backgrounds for what it is, but this is like very heavy on it, very movie-esque. And then the character layer, it goes even beyond what we saw in Clannad. It goes even beyond what we saw in K-On! In just the sheer level of nuance to the movement, the amount of... And I'm a little maybe particularly attuned to this right now, because the chapter in my dissertation I'm writing is about CGI in anime, either sort of full CGI movies that are made in Japan or CGI integration into anime. And obviously one of the debates around that is movement is tough in CGI, especially when it's a new form. And people often, complain about the floatiness of movement. And so I've been thinking about that and looking at that. And then I would go back and watch Hyouka episodes, and the weight of characters and the way every movement feels fully embodied in the character's body. And like, one little movement will affect 7 other parts of their face and body. And the hair is always in perfect proportion. One of the things you get in CGI a lot is the hair falls too slowly, and it looks like they're in like half gravity or 0.75 gravity. And here it is just so on point in every way, and it's building on things we've been talking about since Air, frankly, since the beginning, but like that we really saw in Clannad, that we talked a lot about in K-On!, all of that, just the movement of the entire faces, parts of the body that are often static in anime that are in motion here. And again, because so much of this show is conversations, the storyboarding has to be so engaging and so precise, and it is so rooted in like actual photography ideas. And then you add on to that just the overwhelming nuance of the character performance of the animation, how real these characters feel as performed by the animators. Before you even add on, you could turn these on mute. As great as the voice cast is, you would still get so much of the storytelling just from the visual layer. I know I'm rambling on and on here, but I could do it all day. This show is unreal to me.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think the thing that really stood out to me, especially when I went back through some of the episodes to take screenshots for my notes, is just like how thoughtful the quote unquote camera placement is. Obviously, there's no actual camera, but like with Haruhi, they are so deliberate in choosing very physicalized sort of camera angles that make it look like you're like an observer in this space. And there's lots of like camera tricks they use, and it's the use of depth of field that to me is like crazy. There's such a expert level use of that technique, and it's certainly not uncommon in modern anime in particular to use depth of field effects, but the expertness with which it's used here, and because there's a variety to it as well. Like there are lots of really interesting shots that are super close up on like someone's face, where the depth of field is so shallow or whatever, where like the front part of their face, the part closer to camera, will be in focus, but as their moves like further down their face, the further away starts to get a little bit out of focus, which is just such a kind of like very nuanced, detailed use of that technique that you're dialing it in so close rather than just having it be, oh, the characters kind of on the front layer are in focus and the background layer is a little bit out of focus, or you maybe have like one thing in the background layer that is out of focus, but you want to shift people's attention to it. So now you've shifted your focus so that that thing is in focus and what is in the foreground is out of focus. That's stuff you've seen in anime. But the amount with which they play around to it here and create whole kinds of interesting dynamic shots that add so much depth to the imagery that really make these locations feel like real places and you're looking at like real images, even though obviously it's still very artificial, it's still very animated. But by layering those different kinds of camera techniques on top of it adds this level of kind of verisimilitude to it that just pushes the aesthetic to this whole other level. And when you combine that with the really intentional kind of camera placement and shot choice, it just makes this show's whole visual language so dynamic, so compelling, so interesting that, yeah, like this is by far the most screenshots I've taken for a single show, where I've got one of the episodes I took like 150 something screenshots on, because there's so many scenes where I want to take a screenshot of every single shot in that scene, even if it's just two people talking, because of how much interesting information is being delivered through those shot choices and through the character placement and the blocking and all of that, because that's how they're telling their story. That's how they're showing the relationship between the characters is through camera blocking and choices and things like that. So yeah, yes. The whole aesthetic of this show is just incredible.
And just to piggyback on that, Sean, with the photography element and the depth of field and all of that, this show also does have, far and away, more CGI than anything else we've seen from KyoAni. Probably more than every other show we've talked about combined, because of the kind of imagined deduction sequences that often take place in kind of weird dream worlds that often have some CGI in there. And then there's also some camera moves that are just a little bit more free moving than they usually do. But overwhelmingly, this is still very traditional classical sort of animation style in that kind of, handcrafted way that KyoAni is very, that's their thing. They're not ever going to do the UFO table thing and go crazy with CGI cameras, right? So a lot of that depth of field you're talking about, that's just, phenomenal compositing. I mean, first off, it's phenomenal composition in terms of what the storyboard says for the basic, what's the shot going to be, for what the layout of the scene is, for what the animation is. But then, like, if people are wondering, when you see the, the credit, director of photography in an anime, what does that mean? Because it means something completely different than in a movie. Because there is, the director of photography in a movie might be choosing how to compose the shot, and that is not something the director of photography in an anime is doing, because that was chosen back in the storyboard phase. The director of photography is the person who takes all of the pieces of the show and in the old days would, put it on the animation table, get the camera out and composite everything and take the pictures one frame at a time. Today, a lot of that composition is done digitally, but it is that role of like taking the images and layering them and choosing the distance of the layers and the focal length and all of that stuff. And clearly the director of photography for this show, who was Ryuta Nakagami, who is for most of the KyoAni shows that we've watched and will watch, really brilliantly done. And that is a part of anime that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but this is a show where you can see that skillfulness in full bloom all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I want to add on to that with some of the sort of more kind of abstract sequences that visually represent the deduction. Another thing that the show does that's just incredible is the variety of sort of visual styles that those invoke. Because a lot of them do these different kind of handcrafted style presentations. Like in episode 2, you have the whole sequence where they're trying to reason out the schedule of like when people borrowed this book from the library, and you have this really elaborate big sequence that looks like it's handcrafted out of like construction paper, of like, oh, here's this calendar, and then here's a wheel that has all the different days of the week on it, and then they're drawing, like it looks like people drawing in pencil on top of it. And just there's so many different kind of aesthetic choices, and each episode, or most episodes, have a different kind of big standout deduction style sequence that has its own manner of presenting those ideas. It's not like here's the one stock how we do a deduction and this is what that visual language looks like. It's like everybody gets to come up with their own idea of here's how we're going to represent this concept. Like episode 5, the Kigami Yoshiji one, that has this whole amazing sequence where you have the teacher when she was 16 years old at the school. She's like walking on top of what looks like archival footage, like she's walking in front of it. And that whole like aesthetic and the way that looks and the separation between her and this vintage kind of photography that she's standing in front of is such a cool way of representing that idea. And so that's like the other aesthetic layer. And this is where I have to levy one complaint, not at the show, but at the fan community, is that the Sakuga Boru website is sadly very limited for Hyouka. There's lots of good GIFs on there. But for me, in terms of the movement of the show, like the things that are like animated and the kinds of things that I want to capture in GIF rather than as just a screenshot, it's these abstract sequences, because that's where the most movement and kind of action happens. And there's precious little of those, even though that's the most impressive looking animation. And it's something where I feel like it's so interesting and it's so different that it maybe doesn't even occur to people to want to grab those as the GIFs, because they want to go towards the very luscious character animation in like facial expressions, which look great. But those also, I can capture some of that in screenshot form and admire them that way. But a lot of the deduction sequences, they only can really be captured in terms of movement. And like the movement is kind of the point of how they work. And I was disappointed that Sakuga Boru should have like 30 pages of Hyouka GIFs. And it's just not even close to what it needs to be.
See, if I were capturing motion from Hyouka, I would be making a supercut of every time Chitanda leans into the camera and says, "Ki ni narimasu," because they do it in almost every episode, and they always make it the most lush fucking thing you've ever seen in terms of character animation, and it is amazing, and you could create, I think, a fairly lengthy supercut of every time she does that.
Yes, I'm sure there must be a Ki ni narimasu supercut on YouTube. That has to exist.
It has to, yeah. The other thing, just to shout out, that we don't maybe talk enough about in these, is the fucking color work in this show is out of this world, and it's so precise and it is so varied also. Like, I think in the school and for a lot of the daily life stuff, the show has a kind of teal wash to it, I would say, and not wash because it's not a tint, but it pushes towards greens. Blues tend to look a little more teal. That is kind of the overall direction it goes to, but there is so much variety around that, and particularly given the last episode, 22, has the just explosion of color at the end with the cherry blossoms. I think it really draws attention to what this show does with color. The colorist on this show and a lot of other Kyoto Animation stuff is Naomi Ishida, and it is just an absolute masterpiece of color setting in an anime, and you see that just episode in, episode out. It is always over the top how great the color work is.
Yeah, especially because, like, the series in a narrative sense draws attention to some of its use of color palette, because part of the kind of like slogan or whatever for Oreki is that he lives a gray toned life. Yeah. As opposed to a rose-colored life or rose-tinted life. And obviously that's part of what that last episode is doing, is playing with those colors. But yes, it's I agree that there's really great use of colors that shift, like in different episodes sometimes will like really kind of occupy different color spaces in ways that are very compelling. Like episode 21, the Valentine episode, which is one of the darkest episodes, like aesthetically that comes across so well, and there's some very interesting color choices there as well. But yes, I mean, top to bottom, I mean, any piece of this show, any element you want to poke at in terms of its visual presentation and visual storytelling, it's just superb. I mean, it's the height of its craft. It's an absolute masterwork. And the show has that reputation amongst like people who know, like the show definitely has this, continues to have this reputation as being like one of the most visually lavish anime TV series that has ever been produced, because I think it just is that. Yes. It's a show that is over 10 years old. It's 12 years old at this point. You could release this show today completely unchanged, and it still would, not only would it look modern, it would look better than other shows coming out. And I think that partially says that, like, I think the aesthetic change of anime has not hugely shifted fundamentally in the past 10 years, but also that, like, what this show is doing is so ahead of its time in terms of some of that, like, photography stuff and some of what it's doing. That means its aesthetic still feels kind of groundbreaking and cutting edge even now. And if you think back to, like, us doing the Lupin the Third podcast, where we watched lots of shows that were separated by about a 10-year gap, they looked, obviously there's something that's like individual style, but also just the whole production of anime and the entire general aesthetic of anime had shifted in that point. Hyouka, you could put it out in 2024 and nobody would bat an eye in terms of it would not look dated or retro in any way, shape, or form.
Well, no, and this show is definitely, I think, on the cutting edge of a general shift in style that is starting to happen. And I think of like landmarks for this also of like Ponyo in 2008, G-Reco in 2015, where anime is going from the very kind of harsh angular style of the 90s and early 2000s to a much rounder, more bulbous style that you're starting to get here. And this is definitely one of the first TV shows that I think is going full bore into that. I mean, even KyoAni, you see it a little bit. Like the key novels, other than Clannad, the first two key novel adaptations are very angular. Haruhi bounces a little bit between kind of angularity and softness. But like this is very much on the sort of Ponyo G-Reco side of things in terms of the kind of roundness that it is embracing. And that's become a pretty big thing in anime all the way up to now. And so it is ahead of its time. And like it is the dominant style still, I think, is something that looks like Hyouka. And we have not seen a big sort of sea change in that yet.
Yes, but Hyouka still is sort of, you know, like, because the other thing I think of that kind of epitomizes some of the style is stuff like Your Name and the Makoto Shinkai movies. And it's like Hyouka just goes pound for pound with those, you know. And it's
better character animation. I think Makoto Shinkai's backgrounds are kind of unparalleled in their sheer like depth and how much he puts into them. But like it's actually one knock I would make against Shinkai generally is I don't think his movies are as great on the character performance side as they are on like some of the storytelling and general composition. This has better character animation than those movies do. It's out of this world. Yeah.
So let's start breaking down some of the specifics of this, and let's talk about episode 1. Because episode 1, that's directed by Takemoto Yasuhiro, and it's just one of the best premiere episodes of an anime. First of all, I want to just point out, this is the third KyoAni TV show in a row we have watched that starts with a shot of Sakura, or like cherry blossom petals, because K-On! Season 2 starts exactly with that shot, Nichijou starts exactly with that shot, and Hyouka starts. They're not the exact same shot, but they're incredibly similar, and it amuses me that
is funny.
They're so similar.
Do you remember what the first shot of Love Chinibyo and Other Delusions is?
Not off the top of my head, no. We will
see.
find out.
Find out next time, yeah.
But so one of the things I think is really fascinating about the first episode is that it is an adaptation of like the first chapter of the first novel, which I have read. That's the only part of the novels I've read, because there's a free sample on Bookwalker, and I was like, sure, I'll check that out. So it's basically the first chapter of the book. And then there is another short story that is what the second half, or really it's like the last third of the episode. The whole thing of Oreki tricking Chitanda because he wants to go home, and so they come up with this whole weird mystery of like some group within the school that's like recruiting people on the club board and all that stuff. And they've kind of like manufactured that because he doesn't want to solve this mystery about a girl seeing like a ghost in the piano room or whatever. That's not from the novel. That is a different short story that they've kind of put here at the end. And I think that's like, it creates such an interesting rhythm for the first episode where you've got this sort of normal mystery, right? The first chapter of that book is designed to set up, here's the core dynamic of the characters. Like, you've got Oreki. Satoshi is there to give you this intro to Oreki and his kind of gray colored life and his whole like, if I'm not going to do it if I don't have to do it, and if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it quickly, like his whole motto, right? That sets up Oreki. Then he meets Chitanda. Chitanda kind of like blows that whole thing up with her Kini Narimasu stuff. And then there's this weird little mystery of her getting locked in the room. They solve the mystery, right? And so it's a great first chapter of a book because it gives you everything you need. It gives you, who are these characters? What is the central like relationship and dynamic there? And then it also gives you this taste of the mystery element that is completely removed from what will later become the full big mystery that will, you know, of Sekitani Jun and all that stuff. I think it's really interesting that then the TV show then adds on this extra little kind of B part that is yet another mystery that Oreki is like desperately trying not to have to solve, and he goes out of his way to not solve it. And I think it's cool how they add this extra wrinkle onto the Oreki Chitanda dynamic to show how resistant he is to it. And I think it like really kind of heightens his character growth over the course of the first arc, that they put this extra little story here at the end of episode 1 to show him sort of trying to avoid it. And he has a very interesting conversation with Satoshi on the way home at the end of that episode, where Satoshi kind of pokes him on a little bit and sees what he's doing and sees that he's running away from something that he probably can't run away from.
I agree. And I think episode 1 kind of throws you for a curveball there because it ends on a kind of sour note. It ends on a little bit of a bitter, like, you feel like they've done something kind of wrong in how they've tricked Chitanda, and that Oreki, I think, feels like he's done something wrong, and that something is uncomfortable. And I think we know how this kind of story goes in like this kind of episode 1. The boy who's kind of checked out on life meets girl who brings light into his life story is an anime story as old as time. And we've seen it on this show itself with like Clannad and with Haruhi particularly. And those don't end on, in their first episode, as bitter of notes. I mean, for one, Haruhi has a more sort of caustic tone to begin with. Clannad is a little bit more straightforward in how they become friends. Here it is this, like, Oreki's kind of a dick, and Satoshi is helping him be kind of a dick. And so it sets up this kind of tension that is going to be there through a lot of the show, where Oreki's, I think, journey is not as smooth as I expected it to be right away. I even made a joke on Twitter when he first says his motto of like, you know, if I don't have to do something, I won't, and if I have to, I'll do it as quickly as possible. And I went, man, I wonder if this character will go through experiences that change his outlook on life. And of course he does, but I don't think it happens in as linear a progression as you expect. Like, to the degree that there's a lot of this show where I think it's never said, but I feel like it's more than just, this is a person who's kind of detached. It feels like he has like actual like depressive symptoms, and like he might actually have some issues he needs to work through. And the end of the show is not he has completely rehabilitated and is on board. This does not have the same kind of like closure as the disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, where like you haven't literally seen Haruhi and Kyon like get together as a couple, but it's all coming, right? You like know how it's ending. It ends with him smiling and thinking about how he wants to go into the room and taste their cooking and all this stuff. And he's still pushing through these problems, and the ending is not he has pushed through them, it's that he wants to push through them, and that is the actual like arc of the show. And I think that's reflected right from the beginning, that it's not going to be as easy as it often is in some of these stories. Yeah.
You also have that big kind of like, what in my mind is like this very iconic scene in Hyouka, which is also, this is the scene where you're like, okay, this is Takemura Yasuhiro directing this show, which is the first proper Kini Narimasu, which is the most powerful Kini Narimasu of them all, where there's this whole like imagined sequence where Oreki sees himself and imagines himself being entangled in Chitanda's hair like it's a massive web, and it's also covered in these like kind of green flowers. And you have that sequence, and with them kind of like stuck together, staring into each other's eyes and being reflected in each other's eyes. And then he has a flash to it again near the end when she asks for his application to the club, and he gives it to her and is surprised at the fact that he gave it to her. Like, he gives it to her and goes, oh, like right when she takes it. And this is like one of the only good little like morsels of behind the scenes stuff I was able to find. Is I did find a 30-minute video on YouTube of a bunch of the people. It was like Takemoto Yasuhiro was there, Tanaka Kohei was there, Gato Shoji was there, and some of the voice actors on like a showing of the first episode, or it might have been the first couple of episodes, and they talk about it. And there's a question about this scene. I think from Satomi, the actress who plays Chitanda, mentioned it, and then Takemoto talks about it. And he describes it, I thought this was like very interesting. He describes it as his counterattack on the novel, and not in an aggressive way, in a kind of a playful way. Because he talks about how, like, in the novel, right, you have this, he describes it as like the sea of words that it's able to use to express its story. But as an anime, you're in a visual medium, and you need to try to find a way to express some of these concepts visually. And I think if there's one thing we've noticed about a lot of Takemoto Yasuhiro's stuff, is that he's a weirdo, right? Like, especially as epitomized by the Lucky Star OVA, which is just still the weirdest fucking thing we've watched. And then the elevator sequence in Nichijou, which is also just fucking crazy. And then I can also like vouch for some of the OVA stuff that I watched in the lead up to us doing this podcast series. That was mostly directed by him. Is he's got kind of this sort of weird streak, in this kind of more experimental streak, and that scene with the hair is just bizarre. And it's like, it's the most extreme visual this show has. Like, you go all the way through the rest of it, there's nothing that I think it goes as kind of over the top in some ways and as sort of excessive as that shot of him entangled in her hair like a web. And it's interesting of him sort of framing it as this counterattack, because if you read the novel is very well written, or at least like that first chapter I read, I thought was very well written, but it's pretty dry and it's fairly flat. And it's written from Oreki's POV. And so you'd expect it to be presented in this fairly flat way, but there's certainly nothing literary about the scene where she says "Kini narimasu" that expresses it to this extent, right? He is not literalizing in that scene a metaphor and analogy that the book uses. And if you compare the language in Hyouka to the writing in, say, The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi, the Suzumiya Haruhi writing, like in literature form, is very literary, because Kyon is a very sort of emotive narrator. He uses lots of analogies and metaphors and literary expressions to express himself, and kind of distorts a little bit of what he relates to the reader. He's a form of unreliable narrator. And so I think that there's a lot of space to try to translate those literary elements into a visual element, whereas here it feels more like an act of invention. Rather than an act of translating something from one medium to the next. I mean, it is him taking this kernel of an idea of the relationship between Oreki and Chitanda, but it's him exploding it into something that is a like radically different kind of expression of what that relationship is, while still getting at what is meant to be the same fundamental idea. And I think that scene sets the kind of tone and style for the show, which is that it's mostly represents and translates the kind of tone and style of the books, and is fairly flat, is fairly plain, is like interesting in how it's expressed, but it's in this kind of slightly more gray Oregi kind of tone. And then there are these brief flashes of this counterattack of something that is wildly creative, hugely visually inventive, just explodes into this whole other expressive territory in visual language. And I think like him starting with episode 1 with the most extreme and kind of ridiculous one of those really kind of gives this show, it sets the show off on this very interesting foot that gives the other directors, I think, like a clear kind of direction of what the style of the show is going to be.
Absolutely. I think, and it's so fun to get to see, because in our progression, this is the first Takemoto solo show we've watched. He has done other ones. He did Full Metal Panic, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's done other ones, but like I do think that sensibility that he has really permeates the show. The scene you're talking about, I have just had playing on Sakagoboru while you've been talking, and I've watched it over and over, and it is, you know, it might be the best set of cuts in this show. It is just an incredible piece of animation. But I also, you know, this got me thinking, last night I was thinking about a lot of this, Sean, about kind of that contrast in stylism that this show has. And it also got me thinking about one of the interesting things about Kyoto Animation, and we've talked about this a little bit, they very rarely adapt manga. When they do adapt manga, they do like 4 panels like Lucky Star, or something like Nichijou that is very weird and off the beaten path, and that they have a lot of room to expand upon. And I do think some of that is that when you have a manga adaptation, it is not as simple as saying the manga is the storyboard. But the manga is a very literal like battle plan for how you're going to visually take things. And it does take obviously a ton of talent to take even the best manga and make a good anime out of it. But it doesn't give the same kind of degree of freedom to do things like this. And I think there's a reason why KyoAni and the artists there are attracted to things like visual novels and light novels, where maybe you have some visual inspirations from the character designs or some of the backgrounds, but the actual visual storytelling, the progression of images in a sequence is all on them, and they get to invent from the ground up. And so that gives you the room for something like a Hyouka, where there's a lot in this adaptation that, as you're saying, is not really there in the books. It's not necessarily that they're adding plot things, but they are representing the character's internality and ideas in a way that is like intensely non-literary. And that is part of the thing that makes Hyouka interesting, is that as you're watching it, you can feel how literary the source material is. Because they're name-checking it constantly, the Agatha Christie and the Arthur Conan Doyle, and that this is very literary in form. It is people talking in rooms. It has those short stories have, if you've read the 5 Yellow Pips or 5 Orange Pips and all that stuff and all your favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, you recognize the shape of these things, right?
Yes.
But then the way it is done is so cinematic and often somewhat even surreal and experimental. And that is what is, I think, part of the KyoAni touch, is that kind of elevation and transformation that a lot of anime don't necessarily get to make, because they're pulling from source material that already has a kind of continuous flow of images to draw from.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's something that continues to be true past this point, is that they are either making original anime or they're making adaptations of light novels. And I think you're right. I think like part of it is that it gives them this whole big space to play in, and kind of stretch their legs visually as a studio and establish their own kind of visual identity. It allows a whole different kind of story to be told here. And yes, and just episode 1, I'm just looking at all my screenshots for it. It's just, it's amazing. Because I just love the contrast of, here's like really interesting shots of people in rooms talking. That are the kinds of things we've seen in K-On! And Haruhi, with like really interesting blocking and framing and use of colors and light and the camera and photography tricks. And then all of a sudden it's like, here's this crazy scene of when Satoshi is relating this horror story to Oreki, and it's like, and I don't even know how to describe like what they're doing to express it, of like the way they're using colors that looks like it's drawn on this kind of like almost watercolor on this rough paper.
It's very Junji Ito-esque is like I think an obvious referent for them.
Yeah, but there's such a physical texture to the image where you can like feel this like rough paper that's written on, and it's like there's all this breakup in the coloring, and it's just so fascinating to that contrast in the imagery and all the visual metaphors that are used. There's the scene near the end of that episode where they go to check the bulletin board, and Oreki has this sort of like vision of all the kanji from all the club posters pouring out of the wall and like consuming him, and he's kind of overwhelmed by it. I think he describes it as like, I'm overwhelmed by like their like positive school attitude or something like that. But it's such a cool contrast in the show, where I think you have a lot of anime that would like be like exist more prominently in that kind of very surreal or strange space. Something like maybe the most heightened version of that would be like the Bakemonogatari series, that is always surreal. You kind of are never sure what is really physically, literally happening here. Or you have something that's much more like K-On! Or Haruhi, that's very grounded in whatever reality it's taking place in, and maybe like make some exceptions to sort of chibify or do a little kind of like moe representation of the characters, but is not going to go so experimental and change the whole kind of visual medium through which it's presenting the imagery to you, which Hyouka usually does a couple of times an episode.
Yeah, and it's a very cool element of the show, and it definitely keeps you on your feet visually. While we're talking about this first arc, which I think is the next thing we kind of probably want to get into, should we also just quickly shout out the 4 main voice actors and talk about our main group of club members? Because this show has a remarkable central cast.
Yes, and we're dealing with a lot of Kyoani vets at this point. So we've got our main character, obviously Oreki Hotaro, voiced by Nakamura Yuichi, whom we have talked about many times now, going at least back to Double O Gundam with Mr. Bushido, along with, I always forget how many Gundam things he said, because, that's right. He's also E.O. Fleming in Gundam Thunderball, and he's Riccardo Fellini, everybody's favorite Italian Gundam fighter in Gundam Build Fighters, and he's just in fucking everything. Obviously, Satoru Gojo Satoru in Jujutsu Kaisen. He's also Japanese Captain America, which is fun. But, of course, for us, so far with the Kyoto Vacation, he is Okazaki, the main character in Clannad. And it's his role as Oreki is so interesting to me because it's just not the kind of character you would expect Nakamura Yuichi to voice, even at this point. When
this is what I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, when he was not as kind of like, typecast is maybe overstating it, but right, he's got like a certain kind of character you expect him to play, which is a kind of like tougher character, tough guy kind of character. There's a reason why he's Japanese Captain America or he's Gojo in Jujutsu Kaisen. He's got such a kind of rich, deep voice that those are the kinds of characters he usually plays. And even Okazaki in Clannad is kind of a hard-edged character, right? He's a punk. He's someone who gets into fights. Right? He brings out that quality. Oreki is such a soft-spoken character. And if you cast this show today, I think your instincts would immediately be to go to an actor like Hanai Natsuki or Ono Kensho, Saito Soma, right? That kind of actor that's much more soft-spoken, plays these kinds of characters. And Hanai Natsuki would have been very active in playing main characters in 2012. I think this is not that far away from Your Lie in April, where he plays the main character that is a very Oreki-esque kind of protagonist, this kind of slightly dark, gloomy, kind of, but also sort of sweet high school boy. But I think the choice of having Nakamura play Oreki is so canny because he has to play it so soft and kind of timid. But underneath that, I think you can still feel that kind of the strength of his voice is there. And every once in a while, every couple of episodes, it comes through, right? It comes through a little bit at the end of the Hyouka arc when he's the one who, when he solves it and he's sort of frustrated that nobody else has figured out what the pun is. That's kind of so horrifying. It comes out near the end of the end credits of the Fool arc, where he becomes very frustrated with Irisu Senpai. I think where you hear it the most distinctively is in the Valentine Day episode when he is just completely fed up with Satoshi's bullshit. He starts to call him on it, and he just says Satoshi in the club room, and tells him look, I've basically figured out what happened here. And I think that dynamic, that's why you get Nakamura there, is to give this feeling of there is something in Oreki, there is a strength of character there that he doesn't really recognize, that you want him to see and start pulling out, because it is frustrating often to watch him and how timid he is and how often that kind of leads him astray and how restrained he is and how much he's kind of bottling himself up. And I think that contrast in the performance, it's really interesting and it's very cool, and it shows also Nakamura's range as an actor, that he's obviously so good he can play a character like this that's a bit against type and absolutely knock it out of the park.
Absolutely, and this is what I wanted to say about it too. It's the most different role I've ever heard him play. And Clannad was already slightly off the beaten path for him, I feel in some of that character's sort of darkness, or not darkness, but he's a little bit internalized early on in a way that I think of Nakamura's roles often as very extroverted characters. Hotaro is the ultimate introvert in terms of anime characters, right? But I do think I think the counterexample is good to think about, because you said Ono Kensho or Hanai Natsuki, and I can imagine them doing this, but I think it would be slightly off, because I think actors like that, they can do a softness, but I think that softness comes with a concomitant kind of sweetness to it, or a earnestness that I don't think Oreki has. Oreki's also a little hard-edged in that he is so cynical And in that cynicism, again, I think they never name it this, but there are moments that I feel like are very much made and performed with the intention of like, I think he has deeper issues going on than being a little cynical about school. Like, he has very real symptoms of depression going on in this show. And this never becomes like a mental health focused narrative or anything like that. But I feel like his introversion goes, or his behavior goes beyond normal introversion. But I think within that, you do have, as you say, this force of will. And you also have just little pockets of like anger or fierceness or things like that. And so Nakamura can do all of that with, I think, a little bit of that edge that I don't know you would get from other, and again, these other actors we're naming are phenomenal actors. We're not putting them down. Everyone is just right and wrong for different roles. And I do think like Nakamura is probably not the first person you would have thought for this, unless you're the team that did Clannad. And then I think you would maybe think about all of the range that character has to go through over the course of Clannad, where it's a whole human life, basically. And I think you can see that, and it is a very, very smart choice. And it's one of his best performances. It's just incredible. Like, the amount of vocal control he has to do to pull this character off is extremely impressive.
Yeah, it definitely, it feels like a thing that he would only be cast for with a studio that like has had him play a main character, kind of, like had that whole experience with him. There's a familiarity there where it feels like they know, because it's the same as with every Kyoto show. It's the same voice director. So, so it's like they really know what they're doing with their actors, which you also know because similarly, just like even more different really is Sato Misato as Chitanda Eru, whom we know very well from K-On! As she is the Bucho. She's Ditsu Tainaka in K-On!, and it is just the most different sounding character in the fucking world. Like, I constantly, in watching the show, my mind would just wander to the trailer for the K-On! Movie, which I saw multiple times because I watched all of them, and all on the Blu-ray set because they're fun. But on every single version of the trailer, they always had the line that Mitsu says where she goes, "Whoa, rock and roll!" And every time Chitanda would say something, and I would just be like, that's the same actress. It's like, they're so... It is not that she's necessarily doing something in terms of like the quality of the voice that's hugely different. It's just the characters are so different. They're such different people. You would never, ever peg them as being voiced by the same person. And it's an amazing performance because Chitanda has so many different sides to her that you see throughout the whole show. Obviously, there's like the very clear kini narimasu and like that kind of part. But she's got so much like emotive range, whether she's like sort of incredibly hyper, insistent in those ways and that kind of very earnest way she can be. She obviously is like just the most adorable character in the world also, and you have the whole episode where she's going around the culture festival getting roped into random clubs.
So good.
It's the cutest thing. It's like, it's where Hyouka is certainly not, I wouldn't describe it as a moe anime, but Chitanda has a lot of moe elements to her character, and Mayuka does as well to maybe a slightly lesser extent. But
Chitanda is like, if you're on the scale of characters I want to protect at all costs, she is like an S tier, no, like a god tier character I must protect at all costs, with like, throw Anya Forger in there too, just as like the most precious thing in the world is Eru Chitanda. Oh my god.
Yeah. But there's also this much kind of like dark is maybe slightly the wrong word, but like kind of sorrowful side to her that you get, particularly in the first arc and in some of the stuff later in the series, where, she's got this whole, kind of tragic backstory with her uncle Sekitani Jun, and this like deep curiosity to try to remember what he said to her that made her cry. And there's a darkness there, and a sadness there that feels so potent.
Yes.
And there's also this sense of weight of responsibility she has that she takes extremely seriously as being the daughter of this very prestigious family that is one of like the major families of this whole town, that they're like the main rice producer, right? And she takes all of that like very seriously. And when you see her in that capacity, you see this whole other side to her. And obviously, when we talk about episode 22, that's like everything of what episode 22 is about. And it's the thing that makes her so fantastic as a character. And it's why she gets to also be as adorable as she is. And like that, I think, prompts those feelings, that she feels like such a real person. She feels so lived in. She has all these different kinds of sides to her. and I think that's also why Oreki as a person is so fascinated by her as well, and kind of so attracted to her, is because she's got this like real depth and variety to who she is as a person. And then Satomi, just, you know, the way that she expresses that as an actress is incredible, especially when you think about the contrast between this character and Ritsu and Keion. It's just insane.
The Ritsu contrast is just fucking hilarious when you think about it, because I would have to like continually remind myself, like, I know this voice. Where do I know it from? And I'm like, this is the 5th time I've looked up that she was in Keion, and it's just never going to sink in. Part of that is just down to, this is something you can do with the Japanese language, is, you know, those characters talk so differently, like in a written way. They are practically speaking different languages at a certain point, right? But I do think, yeah, that breadth of the character, particularly in those later episodes where we see her more in her role as basically the, you know, heiress to this important family, and she can play that role very well, but it's not necessarily what comes most naturally to her, because naturally she's kind of a goofball in her natural habitat, like we see at the Culture Festival. But yeah, she's terrific. She plays off Nakamura so well. It's an incredible performance, and a wonderful character who has some of the best anime eyes in the history of anime eyes, and some of the most lovingly drawn anime eyes.
Absolutely.
The other fun thing they do with casting that I thought you were going to say earlier is getting the band back together and having Daisuke Sakaguchi be Satoshi, and recreating the dynamic from Clannad, where they were also like the buddies from school, where he was Sunohara in Clannad, and we loved him, and he was such a great goofball. A more prominent character here, because there's big parts of Clannad that Sunohara does not show up for. Obviously, Satoshi is there in every episode here, and I do think Yuichi Nakamura and Daisuke Sakaguchi is one of my just favorite anime vocal pairings of all time between these two shows. They are so good together. And I think this is one of the best performances from Sakaguchi I've ever heard. It takes even further what Clannad did, where Clannad is the character is kind of the goofball who has a darker, deeper side we see a couple of times. And he's a little less of a goofball, but he's also a bit more kind of fraught as a character. And pulling all of that off is great. He's frequently very funny, very charming. I think it's hilarious that Daisuke Sakaguchi got his start on Victory Gundam Azusa, where none of this was true. That he was playing the most miserable character in the history of anime. But then you do get, in some of the darker episodes, like the Valentine's Day one, a real sense of humanity from this person, and in a way that I think is recognizable and complex as a teenager. He's tremendous.
Yeah, Satoshi's an amazing character. I mean, the way in which they're able to find those multiple sides of him, kind of like with Chitanda. I mean, this is like one of the big things when we get to the Culture Festival arc. That's like kind of the point of the Culture Festival arc, is it allows you to see all the different sides of the people who aren't Oreki, because he takes a back seat in that arc in many ways. And yeah, the ways in which they're really willing to let Satoshi be, like, sometimes pretty, like, unlikable, and this very frictious character, where there's some really kind of ugly sides to him as a person. And, you know, his relationship with Oreki is so complicated, because I think you get the sense that he does really care about him a lot as a friend, but there are all these really complicated feelings of like jealousy and envy that are wrapped up in that cause him to sometimes poke at Oreki in ways that feel kind of cruel and a bit mean. And some of those, it could, you know, there's like a whole, it's a very authentic like teenage boy relationship, that there's this kind of spectrum where like oftentimes it feels very playful, and then sometimes it just goes a little bit too far, and sometimes it feels like there's a little too much barb to it, and maybe Oreki needs those barbs sometimes, and maybe sometimes it's just like, do you have to be such a dick all the time? That's what sometimes like with the OVA, that's a little bit where they come across in that. And I think like Satoshi, yeah, there's all those different sides to him as a person, but also, you know, he gets to be the guy who runs in with the Jupiter helmet on and go, Galaxy! And then bump his head, and then it's all that shit. It's, you know, he's a man of many, many faces.
I love Daisuke Sakaguchi. One of my favorite, like, I would consider him a character actor, right? Like, he's never, except when he was like a kid, he's very rarely the lead in anything, but he is often one of the best supporting performances who, like, sets up so much good stuff. I'm just, you know, I was scrolling through his credits, and I'm like, he even has, I think, one of the most notable roles in, like, Persona 5, as Mishima, the kid who's having the trouble with the Phantom Thieves website. Just, I go through and I'm like, role after role where I'm like, God, I love all of this guy's work. including this show is, and this might be my favorite performance I've heard of his, although the Victory Gundam is a special one too for what Tomino put him through.
Yeah, I mean his big role that everyone would really know him from is Gintama, where he plays Shinpachi, who's one of the main characters there. And I do love that, because Nakamura Yuichi and Tomokazu Sugita, who plays Gintoki and Gintama, also obviously Kyon in Haruhi, like they're like really good friends in real life, and like the joke is always that they're basically like an old married couple. And I like that they both have their like the same mistress. I don't know, in that metaphor, like they both have these like long running working relationships with Sakaguchi Daisuke, and I love that. There's something about that dynamic I find fucking hilarious. That both of them work so much with him, and that Sakaguchi Daisuke is such a versatile actor that can play so many interesting characters in so many different ways.
Yeah, and then we've got one more, and this is a big one.
Yes, then now we have someone we have not yet talked about with Kyoani, but is a big actress who's in so much stuff, especially nowadays, is Kaino Ai as Mayaka, whom maybe like the thing that we've talked about kind of like around the edges, or there's a couple of things we've talked about around the edges that she's in that people would definitely know, which is Darkness in Konosuba, the masochistic paladin, which is just one of the best.
She's so funny.
Characters.
She's so funny in that.
Yes, such a fucking great role. She's also, if you've watched all of the Sword Art Online anime, she was Alice, who's kind of like effectively the main character of the last season of that show, and a kind of a co-star character in the penultimate season of what's been adapted so far. But she's in so much other stuff. She's also, eventually, one day we will get around to Anohana with that season, and she plays Menma, who's like one of the most key characters in that show. She is Shiro in No Game No Life, and Masahiro Shina in Sakura no Pet no Kanajo, which both came out a little bit before this. So it really feels like Kaino Ai like came in really strong 2011, 2012, and was got like a lot of really big roles. And she's just been in a bunch of other stuff. I also relatively recently played the Tsukihime remake, where she plays a new character they added into that game named Noelle, and that is a great character. That talk about a character with a lot of sides. That character is fucking crazy, and people will soon be able to experience that because the Tsukihime remake is coming out in English too. So look forward to Noelle, who is a nun, and she's crazy. That character is nuts. One other note I have is that, like with the 2011 thing, so 2011 was her big breakout year because that's when she played Minma in Anohana, and she also played one of the leads in the Chihayafuru Kanade, and that was the year she won Best Rookie Award at the 6th Seiyu Awards. So, big actress in basically everything nowadays. This is not necessarily her breakout role, but one of those kind of early 2010s roles that like really kind of propelled her to the stratosphere.
Yeah. And it's a great performance, too. Ibara is the last one who comes in. She's the one who hangs out. She works at the library, and she's in the manga club. But this is a character who I really love how the layers are peeled back on her over the course of the show, because she's someone we're kept at a somewhat of an arm's length at for a while, because she's the person in the group who's kind of the most non-committal to being there, I think. And she has these other interests, and I think particularly during the culture festival arc, she gets such a great showcase as we see her love for manga and doujin and all of this stuff, and that she's a otaku, but she's kind of quiet about it. She doesn't like them coming up and saying the word cosplay to her, and there's that whole side of her where she's very soulful about these passions. And of course, she also has this crush on Satoshi. She's a bit more emotionally mature than he is. Great character who is, very firmly a supporting player, but is like a rich enough character that she could be her own anime hero. She's such a great character. Yeah,
because it's the thing that one of the things I love about her is she's sort of like, if you look at her from a distance and kind of squint, she's sort of like a tsundere character type, but really there's not really much dere there. She's mostly like very prickly and kind of aggressive. It's certainly towards Oreki, who she doesn't have any romantic feelings for him at all. But she is, she is a better friend than she maybe like kind of puts on for herself.
Yes.
Is kind of maybe the tsundere part. But yeah, the one thing I think is fascinating about her character is that kind of you peel back the layers, or you don't know her that well or early on because she and Oreki don't have the most sort of familiar relationship. And anytime her and Oreki are left alone in a room, which happens a couple times over the series, it's like the most awkward thing in the world, which really captures that feeling of like a friend of a friend kind of relationship where you realize we're all in the same friend group, but I'm not really friends with you specifically.
Yes.
In that kind of weird, awkward interactions. But there's a whole thing with her where during the end credits of the Fool arc, there's all that conversation about Sherlock Holmes happens, and Satoshi, when he's explaining that he is someone who sort of like goes in and sort of peruses 100 different genres, but will never be an expert in any of them. And he says that, if Mayuka took an interest in it, I can guarantee you within a couple of months she would know and be so much more of an expert at Sherlock Holmes than I am. And in the moment when he says that, like, I think you're meant to be like, what are you even talking about? Like, why would, like, what is it about her? There's nothing about her that seems to indicate that. But then once you get to the manga stuff in the culture research arc or the culture festival arc, you realize, oh yeah, no, that is her personality. Like, she is actually a kind of mega nerd, because she's going cosplayed as like a character from some obscure 1970s manga that was adapted into a single movie, but she's using the manga version of the character's outfit. Like she is a hardcore, like, classic manga nerd, and there's clear that she has a lot of passion for the things that she is interested in. And I like the way that the anime kind of reveals that it's sort of slowly over time you see that there's that whole part of her character inside who she is a person that Oreki probably has no interest in and he doesn't really see. So it takes a long time for the audience to be able to see it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the main characters. Do you want to talk about how this first story arc, the Hyouka arc itself?
Yes. There's a couple of scenes I kind of want to zoom in. One, sort of like picking up some of what we're talking about, Oreki. The scene in this show that I remember when I originally watched it, which would have been around 2013 or 2014 when I would have originally seen it. There's a scene in this show that has always really stuck out to me a lot. Because it's a scene that I don't think I'd, at that point, seen a piece of media that expressed a feeling that is something that I have definitely felt, particularly when I was a teenager, but have, felt at various points over my life. Whereas there's this scene where at the end of that arc, they've solved the whole thing with the book mystery and stuff in the library, which is a great, weird little mystery about why is this book being checked out. And then all the other three are all kind of goofing around and having fun at the counter at the library. And then all of a sudden the camera sort of shifts over to Oreki's perspective. It kind of comes behind him and the whole scene gets kind of consumed by this dark cloud. And he sits on the side and watches them and he just starts thinking to himself, like, they're having so much fun. Like, is it that they're having so much fun about? Like, why am I not feeling that? Why am I different? What is it that's different? What is it that's different? And he's just sort of consumed by this black cloud while he's saying that. And then he gets snapped out of it when they turn their attention to him. And that is definitely like, I have felt that exact thing at multiple points in my life where it's just been this like, I am not like these people. Like, why are they feeling these things that they're feeling? And why am I feel like I'm this like weird alien on the side? And it's like, it really, I think, captures this sense of kind of like social isolation that I've just very rarely ever seen expressed in a piece of media. Certainly not so artfully like this, because the show doesn't dwell on it either. It doesn't sort of like, it never comes back to that exact thing. Oreki kind of, I think, expresses similar kinds of feelings just in different ways, but they don't make this like the feature of the series. It's not, the story is not about unpacking this emotion in the way that other series that like other really great shows like March Comes in Like a Lion, the shogi series that is very much about a character that has depression and is struggling with dealing with that. It expresses some of these feelings very artfully, but that show is entirely about exploring that character and that side of that character. Whereas this, it's just about like, this is a part of his life and how he views things. And this is like, it gives you, I think, that insight into what he means when he says a kind of gray colored life and what that can feel like at times when you're around people that do not have that, or whatever it is, that lack of something, or that thing that they do have that's allowing them to be in that moment in that way that you do not have. It is a really kind of powerful emotion, this kind of very powerfully dull emotion in some ways. And it's so perfectly expressed in that scene.
Oh, I agree completely. And I think this show does moments like that pretty regularly that makes Hotaro feel like such an immensely real character. I hope you take this in the way I mean it, because I mean it in a good way. He reminds me of you a lot, Sean,
yes,
from high school. He specifically, like, of every anime character I've ever seen, Oreki reminds me a lot of Sean Chapman in high school in a way that feels like very palpable and three-dimensional.
Yes, I mean, I vibe with this character
Yeah.
a lot. Yes, that like I agree that I think that like in both positive ways and negative ways, like I see a lot of myself in him. Again, and you're right, like particularly from high school, and it's like, and it's that scene. It's like I just remember when I watched that again, which when I would have watched it, I would have been like maybe like 19 or 20 years old, so it would have
Yeah.
been that far away from me being this relatively similar age to the characters and just being like, oh fuck, like feeling like seen by a piece
Yeah.
of media in that way, which it's just weird. Other than because we're just also like mentioning Anohana, which kind of Eye is in, which I watched around the same time, that has something very similar, and it was like
Yeah.
there's just like a moment, like a point in my life where I had a lot of self-reflection around these kinds of things because I was seeing it reflected in this media, being like, huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is kind of how I feel sometimes. That's weird. It's like, I've never really seen other characters be like that, huh?
No, but it's great. And yeah, again, I can't really add on to what you said because you said it perfectly, but there is a vividness to the interiority of the characters because so much, it's interesting because this show very rarely verbally addresses Oreki's interiority, but I feel like it visually is a constant through line in the show because so much of it is going inside his head and visualizing things the way he visualizes it, right? And so we have a lot of, and then in more normal sequences like the ones you're talking about, it's basic blocking and shot choice that is doing that for us. But it's a very good way of how you can, imply perspective in a visual medium like this without like, he narrates once in a while, but without literally being like in his eyes for the whole time or something, right? It's something the show is very good at. The main plot of the Hyouka arc, where it is about figuring out, okay, what happened to Chitanda's, it's her uncle, right? Who had something, it's so amazing the like mystery that they lay out and where it goes, because she has the vaguest hints to give Oreki at the beginning of this, right? Of like, my uncle, when I was young, said something that upset me, and I don't know what it was. Can you help me figure it out? That's the like vaguest start to a mystery ever. But it unveils such an interesting conundrum and an interesting piece of history. And it goes back to this period of Japanese history that I'm super fascinated with, and I've read a lot about. It's the 60s, where honestly Japan in the 60s has a lot of similarities to America in the 60s and France in the 60s and some other countries, in that you had this kind of countercultural movement and you have some protests against the government and whatnot, kind of similar to some like France 68 kind of stuff, right? And I think, and then the story here is about someone who, the uncle is a kid who got kind of roped into being the face of this movement at the school to try to keep the cultural festival alive. And there was this fight between the students and the teachers, and he gets sort of, I don't know what you'd say, railroaded for that and gets expelled. And Hyouka is his sort of last statement on it. And it literally means, Hyouka means ice cream, but then it means I scream, which starts out as like, that's an interesting pun, to that's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard. Goes very fast into that. But I really like this mystery. I love the entire approach to it. And I think the history component here that it's bringing in is, again, it's just a super interesting period of Japanese culture and film and everything that I don't think is very well known over here. But it's actually, there's a lot of parallels to like the Red Scare would be another parallel, I think, if you're just trying to draw on Western parallels.
Yeah, it's a great mystery and great story because, it kind of encapsulates some of that kind of like daily life mystery thing of this notion of trying to kind of dig into the past of an older relative or someone to sort of try to unravel something about them, and say like this kind of like very vague hint. He said something to me when I was a little kid that I don't remember, but it made me cry, and he was a member of the Classic Literature Club. And they kind of slowly follow that trail of breadcrumbs to discovering the Hyouka anthologies that are published every year, have to go like find where those are, and get access to them with their senpai who's smoking in the room, which I love that whole little arc where Oreki sort of, figures out it's like, oh, this dude's just, in America, it would be he's smoking marijuana because it's Japan, it's a cigarette. In America, he absolutely was hotboxing that fucking room. But yes, but following all those little like kind of breadcrumb trails, and then this sort of, mystery and the solution to that mystery, obviously also replicating Oreki, right? So you have episode 5, the Kigami Yoshiji episode, which is just, as you would expect, an absolute masterpiece of an episode. It opens with this whole scene after they've done their big kind of meeting at Chitanda's estate, I guess is what you would call it. And they've sort of put together all their different clues, and they're on their way back, and it's raining.
Oh my god, this fucking scene.
Yeah. And Oreki and Satoshi start having this conversation about like what's going on in Oreki's perspective. And this is where he mentions this sort of thought of like, I don't always want to sort of like live or feel the way that I do. Like sometimes I look at you guys and want the things that you have. And while they're having this conversation, slowly the clouds break, and it's the most gorgeous representation of that moment immediately after a rainstorm when the sunbeams break through the clouds. You just have this very kind of delicate golden light that passes over the characters as they look up. And Oreki sees there's a bird flying in the sky that has been one of kind of the narrative or visual framing devices for the scene. And he cycles away with this thought of like wanting to break out of this, that like he's wanting to change. He wants to have more of this rosy colored life. And then that leads to the whole sequence then of him figuring out what it is. He gets the call from his sister that gives him this hint that he's kind of slightly off on the wrong track. He puts it together and they confront the teacher at the end. And that's when he figures out the ice cream thing. But I love that the way that all works narratively is that, yes, it is Sekitani Jun. He is a person who, right, was sort of persecuted upon in a certain way. He was, made to be this martyr, and he left this note of that he wants to be able to scream, but he can't. And so he leaves this very sort of riddle-filled roundabout way of expressing it. And that is like also what Oreki is kind of trying to do. Like he too is a person that wants to scream. What is that scene in episode 2 of him being consumed by darkness, looking at all these people living in the light? What is that other than him wanting to be able to scream, but not knowing how to do it or not feeling like he can do it? So of course he's the person that is able to put it together, and not just put together the broad mystery, but that specific thing of looking at that and being able to see and understand the way in which Sekitani Jun felt in those moments, because I think it replicates or reflects some of the ways that Oreki also feels as a person.
That's so crucial, and it is something this show does several times, where frequently, like, Oreki is very smart, and he's very good at deductions and all of that, right? But also part of how he sometimes gets to the conclusions that other people aren't getting to isn't because he knows more or is able to deduce more. It's that he finds some affinity and empathy with this subject that reflects something in him that he doesn't necessarily want to reveal, but can. And he's even in that scene where he reveals it, he's very frustrated that the others aren't getting it.
Yes.
And I think part of it is him realizing how far he is from them, not in intelligence, but in this kind of emotional experience. I think this is part of what he means when he is continually frustrated with Chitanda being so impressed with him. And like on an objective level as an outsider, of course Chitanda should be impressed with him. He's doing crazy shit over and over again, right? It's inherently impressive. Otherwise he wouldn't be the hero of this TV show. But I understand why he also has this pushback, because he doesn't feel like that because of where these things are coming from. Like the moment of figuring out the note meant I scream does not feel like a victory for him the way it is in a lot of, mystery stories when the person puts it together. It makes him feel shitty. And I think the show imparts that really beautifully, in part because of Kigami Yoshichi's choice of how to visually represent that entire idea, where the internal thought process is the bunny getting torn apart by like the fox, which is just, those images are out of a horror show. You could you could plop them into something else and they would fit very well. They're very striking here.
Yes, and then I do love that, it makes you think about old man Sekitani Jun telling this to his, 6-year-old niece.
I know.
Being like, well, yes, be careful or they will eat you alive. And and just shit on his life. I was like, well, the thought of being eaten alive scared me so much. Like, fuck yeah, of course it does. The thought of being eaten alive scares the shit out of me too. That's a terrifying notion. I don't want to be eaten alive either. It's just an incredible conclusion to this story. One other thing I want to point out about this one, especially episode 5, is you've got the teacher who's voiced by Koyama Mami, of course. So we've got a whole
Big Mom herself.
Yeah, we'll run down some of the ridiculous guest stars they have on this show, because they have so many people that are here for like little tiny 5-sentence roles, you know?
Yes.
But one thing, just like show like KyoAni's dedication to go above and beyond the call of duty, there is a sequence where Oreki puts it together that she's the teacher, that teacher is one of the girl that wrote the prologue or the preface or whatever for the Hyouka anthology, and there's this sequence where they run through her age backwards to show that she's the same person, with all these images from her life. In my screenshots, I maybe got like 1/4 of the images they show. It's crazy how many bespoke images they show in this like really quick short sequence of going backwards through her entire life. Like I highly recommend people go and like go through it basically frame by frame, which is what you have to do, because it's there's an image every single frame. And just look at, holy shit, like look at all of the different little pieces of art they put together, all these really gorgeous drawings showing the entire life of this woman, backwards to her being 16 years old in the 60s during this whole student movement. It's crazy, that sequence.
It's crazy, and it's a great visual representation of a core theme of this arc, and kind of I think, of the show in general, which is the connection of past to present, and that these things are not as distant as they are sometimes felt, and these characters kind of awakening to something over the course of these first 5 episodes that they hadn't even thought about, like the culture festival being something they kind of take for granted, and then in this history that is like very directly connected to them. It is the uncle of one of the 4 main characters. It is this librarian who they've known, you know, at this school and had no idea about, and it is all part of their lives. And that the show even goes on to have an entire arc at the modern day culture festival. And so all of this is connected. I don't think the show has to like verbally belabor that point at any point in the show's run, but it's so good at visually representing these ideas that they stick with you. Yeah,
absolutely. It just makes an incredible first story arc that ties all these pieces together and sets up the kind of overall tone and structure of the show. But it's also fun because it's like, you know, when you look back on it, it is, I think in the moment, it feels like this very big, complicated mystery. But when you look back on it compared to the second and third arc, it's relatively simple. And it's really, you know, the first arc is really, it's a construction of 3 one-off mysteries. And then the Sekitani June stuff is mostly really just dealt with in episode 4 and episode 5. Because Oreki doesn't even find out about it until the beginning of episode 3.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a very different structure compared to the later arcs.
One other thought I had here while I was watching these is, so the title of this show is Hyouka everywhere. The show does not ever go by a translated title. Can you imagine if they had released this show in English as Ice Cream? And that was, we were just talking over and over again about Ice Cream, the great masterpiece TV show.
Yes, well, it helps that Hyouka is kind of like a fancy word for ice cream in Japanese, you know, because they would just call it ice in Japanese and just leave it as that for like what we would normally call ice creams. This is sort of a fancy word. But yes, it would be hilarious if they're just like, and I'm going to watch that great KyoAni mystery show, Ice Cream.
I'm just trying to think of like the title treatment they would have to give it. Actually, this is a weird little thing I'm going to praise. This show might have the best English language title treatment I've seen for an anime, where they found a font for writing it out in Romaji, Hyouka, you know, Hyouka, that so perfectly matches the kanji that is used in the Japanese version that they look like they're from the same pen almost. I'm very impressed by the English language title treatment, which is not something I get to say that often, but there you go.
It's very good. It feels necessary because, you know, it's an untranslatable title.
Yes.
Because like, just like you can't, there's no equivalent word that would give the same kind of impression as Hyouka.
Gelato.
Yes.
I don't know. Something like that.
Slightly fancy ice cream.
Yeah. That would be a weird title too. Slightly fancy ice cream. So after this, we have 2 one-off episodes. We have episode 6, Committing a Cardinal Sin, which is the one about Chitanda does this like weird outburst, right, in class, and they're trying to figure out what that was about.
Yes, that's that one. I was looking at episode 7. Yes, that's
episode 7 is the hot spring one.
Yes, because that's the teacher who got the wrong like thing for the class or whatever. Yes, that's that one.
I love that is like maybe the most aggressively no stakes mystery in this show. It's the one about figuring out, because it's like, how did the teacher start the lesson off on the wrong foot? What did you think about this one, Sean, as a teacher? And the teacher just like dives into the wrong part of the lesson and then gets mad and then figures out their mistake. I was like, oh, I'm kind of curious. Sean, I probably uses more computer tools than this teacher does, but yeah.
I mean, there's a certain kind of teacher, who thinks that they can do no wrong. Is very insistent on this, like, this is the way it is. And like the notion of that, like, I'm going to get mad at them for not knowing this thing that they're supposed to know. Like that immediately just shows you a very different kind of pedagogical attitude than, I guess, my approach. But also, yes, I have daily Google slides that I set up that it would be basically impossible for me to accidentally start the lesson on the wrong page, because was it like he has like a note that because it's the A, right, or whatever, that he writes lowercase because he's a math teacher, which is it's a very interesting kind of deduction. Yes.
So anyway, that's a fun episode. But obviously of these two, the Hot Springs one, as is true in any anime that does a Hot Spring episode, is one of the best episodes of the show.
Yes, the Hot Springs episode is fantastic, in no small part to the fact that we do get our girl from K-On!, Toyosaki Aki, who plays the main character of K-On!, is here as the older sister. Every girl from K-On! Is in the show in one place or another, but Toyosaki Aki gets the biggest role of all of them,
yes.
Other than, obviously, Sato Misato. But yes, I do love this whole arc about the two sisters, the younger sister who wants to go wear the yukata over to the festival. This is one of those that like shows that kind of fun friction between Oreki and Chitanda, where Chitanda wants to see a sort of more idealized sibling relationship between these two girls, and Oreki, because he's got the world's weirdest older sister, who we need to talk about that character some more here. But he's got a much different kind of perspective on how siblings are supposed to be. And I like the ending of that episode, that it kind of falls in the middle, right? That there is this jealousy, there is this sort of, these more complicated emotions between siblings. But when they come home at the end of all of it, or they come back to that Hot Springs Inn at the end of all of it, they see the older sister helping the little sister out and carrying her inside because she hurt herself. And I like that resolution, right? It's just like a great little moment to end on.
It's lovely, and I like that both of their ideas are challenged a little bit. I also just love the general atmosphere of this one with the Hot Springs. I love the recurring joke about Hotaro being like kind of sick on the car ride over, and then he stays in the water too long and passes out and has to be taken inside, and Chitanda is kind of doting on him, and then the whole ghost story, which makes them check out what's going on in the other room. All of that. It's a very good little mystery. And a good, teenage adventure story as well, as we often get in these kinds of shows.
Yes, it's just fun to like have them go to another location and get like that whole Hot Springs Inn, and that location is so well depicted in like the space between, like, we have the two buildings, and the other building is where they can see through to that window and all that. Yeah, like the way that whole space is realized for that one episode is fantastic.
But then we get the second arc from the second book, the Credit Roll of Fools, I guess we'll call this arc. It's 4 episodes. This is just on the level of like mystery solving, my favorite thing in the show. The procedural element, this is the best thing in Hyouka, because the premise of this, Sean, blew my fucking mind. It is such a good premise, which is that one of the other clubs, I guess it's the movie club or something, right? Do they have a specific name?
I don't think it's a club. I think it's just one of the other classes.
Right, okay.
That has their class project.
It's their class project for the festival. Okay, yes. Yeah. So this is building up to the cultural festival. They have made a movie, and they've made a movie that's going to be some kind of murder mystery movie. So Chitanda and the I almost said the K-On!-bu. The Kotenbu are invited over to watch the movie. We see the movie. It is in the tradition of the Mikuru episode of Haruhi, the episode 0 of Magical Mikuru, is a great KyoAni approximating an amateur video project, which is clearly something they have a lot of fun doing. And I think this one is done very differently, because it's done as like a handheld found footage kind of thing, and it's very funny. Weirdly, some of the most CGI they've ever used, because the found footage means they have to do all these 3D camera movements. I actually might mention this sequence in my dissertation, because it's a weirdly complicated sequence for what is trying to look like crappy amateur video.
Yes, because it's the first person point of view. I mean, this is the reason why in my notes I didn't really take screenshots of this episode, because it's like you can't really take screenshots of that sequence in some ways because it doesn't communicate what's going on, because it's all three-dimensional movement into the distance, because it's a 3D camera that's moving forward and backwards, and and then obviously doing some like sweeping movements as well. But yes, because of that, it necessitates like big perspective changes on environments and characters as the camera moves in and back constantly. That makes it, for 2D animation, incredibly complicated, even though the end effect is supposed to be something very plain and ordinary and everyday and kind of shitty looking.
Yes.
It's funny. It's kind of ironic. It must be the most technically complicated thing in this whole show. Like, they must have spent so much time trying to figure out how to realize that sequence.
Because that's the thing, like, the CGI doesn't have to hide itself as much in like the dream sequences or the deduction sequences, because it's just obviously not real, but it's supposed to look naturalistic like the rest of the show. Anyway, we could nerd out about this forever, but the point is, they have this video, they're watching it, it cuts off after the murder but before the murder is solved, and they did not finish making the movie. The writer is out sick and can't communicate to tell them what the ending was supposed to be. So this class, having heard of the Classic Literature Club's reputation, wants to get their help to figure out, from the script that was written so far, what is the ending of this supposed to be? And they have multiple detectives, people who were involved on set, who have their own theories. And at first it's going to be Oreki and company are going to help figure out who has the right theory. And then, of course, eventually Oreki's going to throw himself into it fully. But I cannot tell you, Sean, how when I realized what the full premise of this story arc was, how giddy I was, because it's such a good fucking idea for a mystery. The idea that the mystery is solving a fictional mystery that went unfinished. I feel like you could make a very serious version of this about like an author who died or something. You could make an even sillier version of it than what they do here, but it is a phenomenal premise that then is like somehow even better in its execution because of the number of layers of like the other detectives whose theories they are hearing, which is so fun, or the fact that Hotaro does come to what seems like an absolutely brilliant deduction about it that is then completely fucking wrong. And then the actual story is this very interesting like thing where you have to kind of empathize with this other person, and this is actually about kind of the limits of Hotaro's empathy. But I love this story arc. I think it's so good, and again, on that procedural like mystery level, it's my favorite stuff in the show.
Yeah. The middle arc, this is everything after this point is also phenomenal. But this is my favorite one. I definitely see why you put the Culture Festival one even above this, but for me, this is like, oh my God, this arc is just crazy. I mean, it does so much stuff, because yes, it's on the mystery level, it's phenomenal, because I'm with you. When I originally watched this, I saw that episode 8 where they lay out the whole thing and they watch the movie and all that shit, and just being like, this is the fucking best idea for a story, like a mystery story ever. But of course, like, the thing that it does that's genius is that it's not about the mystery in that movie, right? This is like one of the best examples of the ways in which this genre of the daily life mystery thing kind of like takes the fundamental storytelling principles of the classic mystery writers, but applies it to this sort of different thing, that it's no longer about actual crimes being committed, and it's not heightened in that way. It's about like, extraordinary but everyday circumstances. And I think the way in which this, your normal mystery is always going to have your kind of like fundamental red herring thing of where here's the thing that at first you think this is what the mystery is, but that at some point you realize that's not truly the mystery. Here is the real mystery that's trying to be solved. And that's kind of often like a Holmes story. How that's represented is that Sherlock Holmes early on usually already knows, and he has figured out from the very beginning what the real mystery is, but Watson doesn't know it yet. Watson kind of is thinking of it this one way, and then slowly over the course of the case, you slowly start to see, this is really actually just what the true mystery is. It's not about this thing, it's about something else. And that's what this is, right? So you think it's about trying to sort of solve what happened at the end of the script, and like, how is the movie quote unquote supposed to end? And Oreki comes up with a genius solution to that. That is, part of the point of it is it's a better solution than the writer would have come up with or did come up with originally. But Oreki was trying to solve the wrong thing the entire time. What Chitanda was Kini Narimasu all about was not how is this movie going to end? It's what has caused this situation to happen in the first place. That's the real mystery. And Oreki allows himself to sort of be chained up and kind of baited into this whole other thing. And it's just that whole dynamic of it is phenomenal. And I think the reveal of that Oreki has been completely manipulated and misled it gives it this like very dramatic kind of darker quality to it, and this kind of darker turn. And that's where you get that Irisu senpai character, who is basically this sort of like, evil is probably a strong word to use, but it gets the point across, an evil version of Chitanda, right? She is this reflection of Chitanda, this other woman who is able to sort of like get Oreki to do the things that she wants him to do. Chitanda does it through her like earnestness and her innocence and her like the purity of her desire to learn this stuff. But Irisu does it intentionally by manipulating him, by playing on his sort of like, teenage boy romantic feelings around girls, right? Which he obviously has with like Chitanda. When Chitanda gets very physically close to him, he becomes nervous. Irisu, who you later hear her lay out her entire strategy for how to manipulate people, has her whole thing about, if it's someone of like the opposite sex, take them to somewhere private, which is what she does with him. Flatter them, make them hear what they want to hear, make them feel like they're doing you, or make them feel like you're doing them a favor in some ways, which is what she kind of does with Oreki. Like, I'm giving you this chance to show off who you really are and like be the special person you want to be. And the way in which that sort of plays on all these little pieces of kind of insecurities Oreki has, of him saying that he's not special, right? He's always playing himself down to other people, but inside, clearly he wants to be this like genius detective. He wants to be this brilliant person who can do things that nobody else can do. He wants to have that kind of power. And so it's very easy to flatter him because there is a kind of narcissism to Oreki and people like him, and I'm including myself in this, that like there's a narcissism in that attitude, in the way in which he's sort of playing humility, and she sees that and she uses that as a weapon against him to manipulate him. And he's played like a complete fool. And that whole dynamic and that whole middle section of this arc is just, it's completely brilliant. It's completely brilliant, and it plays it like resolutely fair with the audience. And I think that's part of what's interesting. Like, you get the hint, because by the time he's solved the mystery seemingly, where he's come up with the found footage solution, where it's basically a Blair Witch Project style thing, but the twist is that you don't know it's that at the beginning, but you find out at the end, and the killer was the person with the camera, which is a great idea for a movie. That'd be better than the actual Blair Witch Project. And but like it's particularly a brilliant idea for a student film project with no budget, where it's like the best you can manage is a complicated narrative twist, because you do not have props really. They've got like the one guy who made the cool fake hand and the blood. you don't have actors worth shit, because this isn't the theater club. This is just a classroom of random people. So it's like they don't have anything. So it's like Oreki ends up creating for them by far like the absolute best thing they could hope to ever have, which is just a cool, interesting twist at the heart of the plot itself that requires very little in terms of technical mastery in order to accomplish. Yes, exactly. But the ways, once he's figured that out, all three of his friends wind up coming up to him and talking to him about this. But first you have Ibara come up and say, but what about the rope? Because there was this scene where we learned about this rope prop, and then you do have this realization where I think the viewer at that point has been swept up like Oreki and has forgotten about the rope, but you realize, you're like, well, yeah, this is clearly wrong, because that rope was just too important. So something has gone wrong. And then there's the Chitanda side of it, which is also kind of where Satoshi comes at it from, which is that this is answering the wrong question. And I had this question throughout those first couple of episodes, is like, this is weirdly convoluted that they can't just go ask, even if she's sick in his home, why can't they just go ask her? And the title of, this is the other thing we haven't talked about, is that the books all have, kind of like Garden of Sinners, they have the English language subtitle that they use at the end of every episode. They put on the title of where which book the episode comes from. And the one for this story is, why didn't she ask Iba, right? So like, why didn't she ask the author? And you're like, I think Iba is like the author's friend or something. But like, right, why didn't they? And I, at a certain point, I was kind of prepared for the story to be like, okay, that's just a weird like anime contrivance, but that winds up being the core of what this story is about.
and it is about this person's insecurities, but a different kind of insecurity that Oreki can't see right away, the way he could see the insecurity that led to the Hyouka of it all in the first story arc. And it is such a good character-driven story.
Yeah, it pushes Oreki to this really interesting place by being this kind of dark reflection of the storyline in the first arc, where now he is being manipulated and he is being kind of tricked into doing this whole thing. And that gives you that episode 10, which is directed by Sakamoto Kazuya, which I think this is the best episode we've seen that he's directed, because this is the one where that starts with this amazing scene between Irisu and Oreki in the restaurant, where they're in this kind of little private room to the side and they're sitting opposite each other. And the way that this whole scene is directed and all the different camera angles that are taken as she is slowly twisting him, slowly like applying like these little tricks to bring him around until that moment where she tells him, "You're special." And there's this explosion, right? That like it kind of reflects in some ways, the scene of him being entangled by Chitanda, where you have these close-ups of the two and seeing each other reflected in their eyes. And then the entire color palette explodes into this kind of pastel space when she tells him that you're special. He tries to deny it. She gives him this whole metaphor that's expressed with these like little silhouette cardboard cutouts on stands of like, oh, what if you had this person who just was like a track star that they never really practiced, but they always won the gold medal? How would someone who practiced every single day feel if they heard that person say, well, you know what, I just got lucky? And, you know, you have this moment of him staring into his glass at his own reflection, asking himself, is it okay? Is it okay for me to believe that I'm special? Is it okay for me to, like, let this go? Is it okay for me to sort of, like, give into this kind of very selfish desire that he and, like, anybody and everybody has? Obviously, because this is also the exact thing that Satoshi struggles about, that we will, like, dive into deeper in the cultural festival arc. But that whole scene and all the different ways that you see her trying to ply Oreki and slowly turn him into putty in her hands, and the way that that's expressed through the visual language and referencing or kind of playing homage to some of the directions in episode 1 with Chitanda, it's a brilliant scene that only KyoAni would be able to do in this way.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And a real centerpiece of this arc, because it is doing really interesting things. And this is where I also want to bring up the OVA, which is in between here. It is the one-off episode between the credit roll of the Fool's story and then the Kanya Festival story. It's between 11 and 12. And I think it's actually really important that it is there for a couple of reasons. One, it gives you a buffer between the two big story arcs, which is, I think, how this show kind of is most comfortably paced, is to have a little bit of space. But also, Hotaro is like pretty depressed in this episode, where he goes and is a lifeguard. And it's because of what has happened up through episode 11, where he was manipulated in this way and he solved the case the wrong way. And he realizes this kind of, the conclusion of it is really sad, about this girl who, you know, wanted to write the story one way. Her classmates didn't like that. She was kind of cut out of the process. It's a really kind of awful thing that he uncovers with his friends. And I like that there's an episode here to kind of process it that is also just your typical KyoAni ONA OVA kind of thing of, let's go to town on some really fancy swimming animation, you know, because this one is beautiful. It's also very funny. It's got another one of the most aggressively low-key mysteries of, I saw something on this lady's ear and we need to figure out what it is. And that's probably the easiest one that he ever has to solve. It's the ice cream from the kid. But I like this episode a lot. And I think if it weren't there, I actually think that transition between the two arcs wouldn't feel as smooth as it does.
Yeah, and I like that arc because it's like you see Oreki kind of in that kind of very depressive place, and then the relationship he has with his friends is so kind of complicated, because there is they really kind of put it to him with them like poking fun at like, Oreki, like, man, what is he doing at a pool? Like, Oreki in a pool, that doesn't go together. And it's like, it's that sense of, they think it's a joke, but especially because of the mental place that he's in right now, it's just kicking someone when they're down, and he's not really taking it that way. And I think it shows that kind of again, this very authentic kind of high school friendship of a certain lack of emotional maturity on the part of everybody involved, that nobody really kind of sees what's going on there and what he's feeling and why he's feeling the way that he's feeling. And yeah, that's so kind of putting it all back together that then lets you get into the Culture Festival arc.
And that Culture Festival arc, which is the next 6 episodes, 12 through 17, I think is just personally an overwhelming masterpiece of anime TV storytelling. It is so many intersecting character arcs because you have all 4 characters, Oreki to a slightly lesser extent, because Hotaro is a little bit more in the background in this one, although still very prevalent and doing some of my favorite stuff he does in the show. He has a full Legend of Zelda trading sequence, and it's beautiful. But you have him, and you have the other 3 members of the Classic Literature Club. They all have pretty detailed character journeys going on through this. There's the overarching story that they have their Hyouka anthology that they are trying to sell, and they ordered too many copies. So the big goal is they want to sell all 200 of their copies. You have, I think, in something that I haven't seen as much in anime, that you really get into all the different sides of the Culture Festival, because they wind up touching on so many other clubs over these 6 episodes, and so many other things that they get into. There's the whole cooking competition, there's the trivia competition, there's the other different clubs like the Wall News Club that they work with. And so you get this really holistic sense of the entire school, of its culture, of these characters, how they all intersect, how all these characters are on their own, separate from one another, and why they're ultimately better together. And then you have this mystery that comes in with the whole Jumanji affair of the character who is stealing from all of the clubs, and we start to realize that this is a mystery, and the way that all dovetails in this way that knocks off every single character's arc of you have Hotaro solve it, but that has implications for Ibara and the manga club and the whole Corpse by Night story that she's obsessed with, and it has implications for Satoshi and his jealousy about Hotaro, and it has implications for Chitanda, and it has implications for how they're able to sell all of the volumes of their anthology, and you have this super satisfying conclusion where they have sold all 200, and then within that, each episode is just so well done. There's so many standout sequences. This is where we have the Naoko Yamada cooking episode. You have, I think, one of the most satisfying, Hotaro puts it all together sequences in the final one. It's incredible. This whole arc blew me away.
Yeah, it's. I definitely agree with you when you said that this is the best Culture Festival arc in anime. I mean, it's the one that also it takes it the most seriously. This show treats the Culture Festival arc the way that a shonen anime treats its big premiere tournament arc or something like that. Where it's oh shit, we're getting into the dark tournament arc in Yu Yu Hakusho. It's oh fuck, we're going to Namek and Dragon Ball. It's just this kind of we're really putting our back into it. Because it's, because it is a long arc. It's most of the second half of the show. The second core is kind of defined by this Culture Festival arc. I think it's one of the reasons why they need to just do let's do a bunch of one-offs afterwards. It's you just can't fit another big story in here because this has so much kind of oxygen that it takes up. There's so much energy. And yeah, I agree. The way in which it breaks off the main cast into their kind of own separate little stories and gives them all their own character arcs, it is so fascinating, and it really kind of helps complete this, I think, trilogy of stories with the first and second one by having Oreki go into the background. It does a few things, it gives you all the space to explore the other characters, especially Mayaka and Satoshi, who you haven't really dug into the kind of meat of who they are as people. But then it also then makes Oreki in some ways even more interesting because you get to see him the way that other people see him, because you don't follow in kind of immaculate detail every single step of him solving the mystery. When he has solved it, it is that much more impressive because you haven't seen all the pieces. Because when you, on all the other story arcs, it makes sense why Oreki kind of puts himself down and says oh, I just got lucky. Because you see him do it, and you see that he makes some mistakes, he gets off on the wrong track. Obviously, the credits roll the fool, he really gets off on the wrong track, and it takes him a lot to actually get to the real solution. It's not a thing that comes easily to him. And so you see that whole process, and so you understand why he's well, I just got lucky. Anyone could have done this if they just spent the time on it, is kind of the perspective he has. But from anyone else's perspective, or specifically Satoshi's perspective, the fact that Oreki was able to identify the one person who was doing this thing out of 1,000 people at this culture festival, with like the one thing he got was his sister giving him that manga, which was like the one thing that allowed him to get kind of like access to a cipher to the code. But even when you give him that, like, it's still insane that you were able to follow the really complicated logical process he takes to eliminate all the variables to narrow down who it is. That becomes so much more impressive because you've been spending time with everybody else and you've not been in his head. So you've only seen the little kind of pieces set up along the way, and then you see him weave all those threads together at the very end. And it definitely makes for, if not necessarily the most satisfying procedural mystery, it is the most satisfying, like, you are the one who did it, right? In classic Agatha Christie fashion, it was you, wasn't it, Senpai?
It's Holmesian. It's directly Holmesian because we're from the Watson position in our perspective, right? Like the standard Sherlock Holmes story is that you are in awe of Holmes at the end when he puts it all together because you're never in his head. You're in Watson's head, and Watson is very smart and observant, but he's not Sherlock Holmes. And so usually we are in the Holmes perspective in Hyouka. We are watching Oreki as he goes through each step of the process, but here, as you say, we don't get that. So this is the only mystery, really, where we get the full Holmes deduction sequence at the end where he puts it all together and there are pieces that we didn't have before then. And it's super duper impressive. But then all the other stories that are going on here I love so much. There's just so much. I think why specifically I think I love this so much as a culture festival arc is we've already seen KyoAni do great individual culture festival episodes or maybe two-parters. Like, obviously, Live Alive, if you're just picking like one episode about a culture festival, might still be, the greatest in that kind of thing because of how beautifully it, I think, handles Kyon and Haruhi's arcs and gives that feeling of being alone at the culture festival and all of that. You get a little bit of it in Kyon with the performances, but I love the breadth of it here. I love how many sides of it you see, how many side characters are coming in and out and being amusing, how many funny things the characters get to do, because also Chitanda has a little bit less narrative weight on her shoulders in this one. She is just furiously trying to run around getting the word out about the Hyouka anthology, but this is where we learn she's not really a great club leader. She's not really great at the whole management thing, and she just keeps getting distracted, and that gets funnier and funnier and funnier. The entire running joke that just killed me in this is Hotaro sitting back in the club room selling them the anthologies and engaging in what I know there's like the Japanese term he gives for it, but I think of it as the Legend of Zelda trade sequence, where he keeps getting weird objects and then trading them out and getting weirder objects. And the payoff in the cooking one of he had gotten the flour and that is how they save the day is that through this very weird trading sequence he's done, including giving someone a fucking pistol and all of this stuff. I mean, it's a water pistol, but it looks very real. And then he's able to throw the flour down, but then that even continues into him getting the manga that he uses. It's such brilliant, like, layered storytelling that we keep coming back to these motifs and developing them over the course of this arc. It's almost like a great piece of music in the way you keep coming back to these ideas and building on them. I love it so much.
Yeah, because they've distributed the storytelling across the four characters that are, for most of it, in separate dimensions. Obviously, they kind of come together again in episode 19 with the Yamada Naoko one, where they're all now working on the cooking show and that competition. So you have this like brief moment of them coming back together, and then they split up a little bit, and then they ultimately solve it. But because you've got that narrative load distributed across the different people, it does mean that like you're able to see all of them in different ways, and you're able to kind of give Oreki this other kind of space. Because, I talked about before that in episode 2, that scene where he's looking on from the sidelines, that like I really vibed with him there. The moment I've most vibed with Oreki is when he like sees this opportunity to be like, oh, you mean I could just sit here and do nothing this entire time and not have to participate in the culture festival? Let me pounce upon this. That was the like... I am literally at this moment currently in the process of doing almost this exact same thing of trying to instill a plan by which I will not have to go to a thing related to work I do not want to have to go to on the upcoming Friday from when we're recording this. So it's like I'm currently doing an Oreki right now. I'm currently trying to come up with a way to get out of doing this shit I don't want to do, and just I would rather do nothing. I would rather sit here in the room and do nothing rather than to interact with any of this. And I gelled a lot with Oreki in that. And yes, he has it's the straw millionaire. I forget what the Japanese word for it, but it's that folk story about someone has like a straw and trades it for a thing, then trades that for a thing, and so on and so forth. And yes, like that whole process, and it being a thing that started because his sister gave him this broken, useless fountain pen that he's just like, why are you foisting your fucking trash on me? And then it going all the way back around to her visiting, and then she's the last piece because she's the one that gets the thing and then gives him the manga. It's like the fact that she set it all in motion is so good. But I love that he calls it the straw millionaire protocol or whatever. him turning to Ibata and being like here, give me something. It's like, what? Give me something for the flower. And I got that through the straw millionaire protocol. I mean, if you're not going to give me something, that means you're breaking the protocol. It's just like, fucking fine, okay.
It's so good. And when I said earlier that I saw a lot of you in Hotaro, this is what I was thinking of more than anything else, is him sitting alone in the room selling the copies. And I think a key thing they get about him and his personality type is that he's not unhappy. He's not he's fine. Yeah. He's like totally down to just sit here and wait. And if something interesting happens, he will 100% engage with it. But he doesn't feel the need to go out there and run around. And this is also where, like, boy, we talked last time on the Nichijou podcast about you have the two main girls that very clearly, like, you are the I forget their
Mio.
names. And I am the other one, and it's
Hyouka.
just very I'm a Yuko and you're a Mio. In this one, it's like I feel very much you are a Hotaro and I am a Satoshi, because the Satoshi thing of running around and trying to do everything to stave off boredom, that's me. You know, when we were debate partners in high school and we would go to the long fucking tournaments, I feel like you were pretty good just sitting there and waiting between rounds. I was the one who started making a whole like movie series while we were there because I was so bored every fucking day we would do that. And I would go do outlandish, ridiculous things. Not quite as outlandish as running around in my Saturn costume like Satoshi does, but like definitely in that vein.
Yes, yeah, it is definitely. I'm very happy. Don't make me do the bullshit. I will sit here in this room. I'm perfectly happy to do that. I just do not want to deal with all this nonsense. That's like, it's the happiest Oreki is the entire show. Is them just letting him sit in this fucking room, because every other story arc they have to drag him around, get him wrapped up in this shit, and he's like, and this is the one where he wins. He just gets to sit there and do nothing, and then eventually the solution falls in his lap and he does his whole Holmes thing, and it's like, there we go.
It's so good. It's so good. We could spend a lot more time talking about this arc, but I don't want to sell the last couple episodes short. Is there anything else to say about the Kanya Fest episodes?
It's just amazing. Like, one thing I want to shout out is the whole Mayaka side to the story, which I love seeing.
Yes.
You know, we kind of talked a little about when we just talked about her, but seeing those other sides to her as a character, like looking up I think it's what, They Were 11, I think is what it's called, whatever, like the kind of classic manga series that is, you know, fairly obscure. It's the kind of thing where it's like, if you're really into classic manga, you will know what that is, but if you are not, you won't. And I love I love the story that's just told between her putting together the simple little cosplay of this classic manga character that, again, there's like an anime movie based on the manga, but the character, if you look it up, looks totally different in the movie, and she specifically is doing the manga outfit. And then all the other girls that are cosplaying you have the main senpai, who she has like the kind of conflict with, is dressed up as SNK fighting game characters. So she's like Nako Dudu, the first one. And then she does a couple other characters. And then all the other ones are Vocaloids. And I love that if you know enough about the characters, like, it tells you everything that you need to know, because none of those other ones are manga characters, even though they're at the Manga Research Club. They're just popular characters. So the fact that Mayaka's there, she actually cares about the manga. She takes that part very seriously. She's obviously very embarrassed about cosplay, but is willing to do it as long as she gets to be the character she wants to be. And all the other girls, they're just dressing up as, you know, popular characters in like sort of otaku sphere in general, like Hatsune Miku. And I think that's just such a brilliant little touch of storytelling.
Oh, I love all of that. I love her, like, she clearly has so much passion for manga on like a really deep, like kind of like the main character in Lucky Star level of like going and finding dojin and all of this stuff and having a passion for the craft of it. And she's drawing and doing all of these things. But she's very shy about it. And I love the general sense also that she's nominally among her peers in this club, but she feels like an outsider. I think all of those, concerns she has and anxieties feel very real. And I do love the ultimate resolution of it keep coming back around to this dojin, this dojinshi she has of the A Corpse by Evening. And the mystery relates to who wrote that at the school, and then her coming to understand the senpai who was kind of a dick earlier and figuring all of that out. It's really beautiful stuff, and that character just gets so deepened over the course of this.
Yeah, it's just a great character. This, that's the benefit of that whole arc, is that it allows her and Satoshi in particular to get all these other layers that then we get to kind of develop as we come into the home stretch.
And in that home stretch, we start with episode 18, another Kitano Hara Noriyuki one, which you have called your favorite of this show, and I am in no position to disagree. I don't know if I could pick my favorite, but this is a good one to pick. It's incredible.
I think especially if you're going for just a normal one-off episode, just like something contained in one episode, like this one, it's so good. One, I just love the sort of twist on the formula that Oreki is the one who incites the plot. It's him vaguely remembering this weird interaction with a teacher in middle school. And he becomes curious about it. And I love the scene where he goes, it's just like, ko, nanteyuka, kininarendayo. And he's just like, he's trying not to say it, because he does say it, and then, they all give him this ridiculous reaction. I love the expressions on the characters' faces when they're like, what? Like, Mayaka looks like she saw someone get shot in front of her. Like, the expression is so extreme. It's so funny. But yes, it's this whole very simple little mystery that it's mostly just Oreki and Chitanda. They basically go on a date to the library that also involves him unraveling this whole thing that two mountaineers that his middle school teacher knew died stranded on a mountain because they couldn't get rescued by a helicopter, which is like the resolution is very like dark in this very kind of quiet, mournful way off on the side. But like the action of the episode is just them going to the library and sort of just poking around about these facts.
Oh, and I think it's one of the best of like the entire slice of life mystery idea of this thing embedded in daily life, where he has just remembered it now as a fact that Ogi Sensei liked helicopters, that this teacher, that left enough of an impression on him that he remembers as a fact that this teacher was a fan of helicopters, which is like not a weird thing for someone to be into helicopters, right? They're a cool, they go, spin around in the sky. They're cool. But like he has remembered this as a fact, but when he brings it up to his friends, they don't. And this is weird to him. And now he wants to figure out why there is this dissonance. And it leads him down this path of realizing this thing he remembered as like a central facet of this person's life and personality was actually about a kind of horrible like sequence of events for this man, where he was a mountaineer and two of his friends died up on a mountain, and he was excited about the helicopter this one time because it meant there was a chance that his friends would get rescued. But as he learns in the newspapers, they weren't. And I think that is a really great story, and it's the kind of story only a show like Hyouka, and there's not many shows like Hyouka, can tell. And it also combines going to the library and doing research, which is my shit. So, I'm into it. I have done that thing of finding a newspaper article and they have to go get the big book that collects them out. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's also, this is the episode that has, you sent me a text after you watched this episode to make sure that I got one of the screenshots from this, because there's the moment where Oreki sees Chitanda comes up on her bike, which she rides across the whole series. She's always on this bike, and she's like, hey, come on, you can hop on the back. And then you get this little dream sequence of him imagining himself, and he's got this just incredible scowl sitting on the back of her bike, and like there's like children's like theater show kind of like big rainbow and cardboard green hills and little butterflies on strings that are there, and he's just so sitting there like on the back of this bicycle. And it is probably the funniest single image in this whole show.
It's great. I've gone through this whole season not texting you about grab an image for me, Sean, but that one I was just like, I'm sure I wrote to you, I'm 99.9% sure you already have this, but just in case I need this, because I might even make this the image for the episode, because it's like, even its like dimensions are right for me layering in our logo and stuff, and it just makes me laugh very hard. So at the very least, it's becoming one of my rotating desktop wallpapers. That's absolutely happening.
It's incredibly funny, but yeah, this whole episode is so, just the mood of it is so palpable. And
Yes.
that's the Kitano Hara Noriyuki of it all, right? That's where I think
Absolutely.
you feel that, oh yeah, this is the dude who did, episode 3 of Kano, and this is the guy who did Someday in the Rain. Like, this is just that, like, you can cut the mood with this episode with a fucking knife, but it's not that, like, the mood is sort of, it's not strong. It's just got this, like, so kind of all-consuming feel to it. And you pointed out, they talked about that scene at the end where they're waiting for the stoplight and they're having that conversation. And that's where Oreki gives his whole thing about how, like, he didn't want to be insensitive, that it's inappropriate for him to just casually say something like, oh, Ogi likes helicopters, when that's not really what happened there. And you see kind of his logic about why this bothered him and why he felt like he needed to pursue this. And, it kind of sparks something in Chitanda. And like that, during that conversation, they let the light go all the way through once, right? That's part of the point of showing it, is that, like, they're so wrapped up in the conversation with each other that they let it go green, go back to red, and then it goes green again at the end.
And it's such a KyoAni touch. It's such a Kitano Hara, like, specific touch to have this, like, very banal daily life signifier running in the background, but we focus on it in its own individual shots that becomes a motif building block of the sequence. It's absolutely masterful. No, this is a great episode, and so is episode 19. Episode 19 is one that to me feels like it was made on a fucking dare, because it is the most two people in a room talking. Like, literally the only two characters who are on screen and talk in this episode is Chitanda and Oreki. And they are in the club room together. Oreki wants to prove that his deductions aren't as impressive as she thinks they are. They hear this announcement on the PA about someone has to come to the office, and they just take that sentence, and the whole episode is them breaking down that sentence and trying to figure out the story, which they apparently just completely fucking nail, because Oreki actually is that impressive. The other thing I love about this episode is that the plot they wind up breaking down is basically directly the plot of the Robert Bresson movie L'Argent, which is about someone who has a huge downfall related to being passed a counterfeit note that we passed from person to person, and that made me laugh when I realized that they were just doing that story here. But it is the most, like, concentrated, we are in a room for 20 minutes, how do we make this visually impressive? And this is an Ogawa Taichi episode, very impressively directed, a lot of great attention to character detail and character animation, and a very impressive one overall.
Yeah, and it's one of those that, like, it's got so much, because it's all just the deduction, right? It's just a concentrated deduction episode. It's got a lot of that, like, interesting abstract representation of their logic and how they're kind of going through it. Yeah, it's super fun. I mean, it's the kind of episode that, if this was like an actual, like, live action TV show version or something, you'd assume they made it because they needed a bottle episode thing, and it's like, well, shit, It's like The Fly in Breaking Bad or something, or like the X-Files would always have 1 or 2 episodes a year where it's like, oh, we got
where you do it on a single set with just main cast members,
yes,
so you don't have to spend extra money, and it's a budget saving measure for other episodes. Obviously not the case here, because animation is animation, it all costs money, and this one is, like, really, like, intensely well animated.
Yeah, it's great. The only thing I have against this episode, like, the one criticism is I do wish that it didn't reveal at the end they were right. I think it would be better if it you just didn't know. Like, were they right? Were they not? Who would know? Like, I think that little extra piece at the very end where he sees the newspaper the next morning and it says that someone was arrested for counterfeit, like a counterfeit operation. I feel like it's just a little bit extra. Like, you don't need it. Like, it works better if it just hangs at the end.
I would agree with that. I think, because it felt like it was going to end. I mean, it even does a kind of, like, fade to black, fade back in. And I think the ending, if you don't see him the next morning, is just so perfect. Because the episode isn't about whether they're right or not by the end. It's about the process of doing it.
Yes.
And it's about the curiosity, and it's kind of about putting to rest this idea that Oreki does not have the same kind of curiosity in him that Chitanda does. He absolutely fucking does, or else he wouldn't go through all this. And like, you don't need to know who's right at the end to make that point. In fact, knowing it kind of dilutes it. So that would be my criticism too. Yeah. Episode 20, we already mentioned, is the Miss Happy New Year one, where they are at the shrine for New Year. It's kind of a setup, I think, for a lot of what happens in episode 22, because it is about him seeing Chitanda in her kind of family environment where she has more kind of pressures on her and has this kind of nobility about her that he doesn't see at school as much. But it is also the classic anime episode where they are locked in a room together and don't want people to think they were locked in the room together, because then it will be a sex thing. And so they are just dropping stuff out the side of the warehouse, of the shed, to try to lure their friends to come get them. And the ultimate solution of Satoshi and Oreki had seen the same episode of this like weird, crazy samurai TV drama, and so he ties the thing on the bag, and that is what gets Satoshi to come down. I laughed very hard at that. It's so good.
Yes, because that is like I mean, it probably didn't actually happen, but it's a real story about Oda Nobunaga and his, I think it's his sister does it, or maybe it's his sister-in-law, and she ties the bag on both ends to be like, I can't escape. And yeah, it's like a whole big thing. Yes, this is like probably like one of the, like, I don't want to use the word weaker. But that's not like relative. Like, this is not one of the episodes that really stands out to me. It's a perfectly fine episode, but it's surrounded by so many episodes that are just so exceptional that I think I agree with what you said, that it feels like it's an episode that's conceptually setting up where the characters are going to need to be in episode 22, and this episode kind of does the work to make that episode be able to kind of start where it starts.
This episode is also held back by its premise in that a lot of it happens in the dark in this shed, where there are minimal opportunities to make the animation pop, right? And so, like, the color work has to be very dark. And so there's less memorable visuals. But I don't really hold that against the episode. I think it does what it needs to do very well. But then the final two are a pretty heavy 1-2 punch to end this series on. And definitely, you kind of forget a lot of what came before by the time you're at the end of 21, or certainly the final sequence of 22. It's wild.
Yeah, so episode 21 is the Valentine's Day episode, also the Satoshi's a Bastard episode, where you get all this stuff about, like, you know, Mayaka and Satoshi's relationship and how she's had a crush on him since middle school, which we've known, but they've never really dived into it. And I like it sort of is, you know, it's paying off a lot of their character stuff from the Culture Festival. This one has so much great visual work. One thing I really have to shout out is how good KyoAni is at representing, like, different, like, textures on screen. And one of those things is like screens. So there's a whole sequence where Satoshi and Oreki are at the arcade, and they fucking play Virtual On, which is an actual arcade game. But the way in which they, like, draw, like, the CRT screens on there, right? They have, like, their own kind of, like, filter kind of look to it. And it's true of, like, whenever they're representing anything, whether it's, like, cardboard for their abstract sequences, the laptop screens you see sometimes, like in the credit rolls of the Fool episode, like, there's a real attention to detail to, like, drawing the pixel, like, framework on screens and stuff like that they're representing with really tight zoom, like, close-ups and stuff. And you really get that a lot here, because there's a lot of big close-ups on them playing Virtual On and that kind of stuff, and they're so good at drawing those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but the main thing
this episode has a lot of impressive animation. So, because you also get a lot of, like, KyoAni's propensity for winter animation in this stretch of the show, which is as impressive as ever. And just one of the most emotionally fraught stories in this whole thing, which is that something happens to the chocolate that Mayaka has brought for Satoshi. And I think Oreki and the viewer, I think, realize immediately what has happened. And that is why it is such a painful second half of this episode, is going through the motions knowing that what happened is Satoshi did something kind of unforgivably awful that he's going to have to atone for in some way.
Yeah, and it's about, diving into that, and it's a great twist on the formula where there is no mystery, right? Like, you know who it is. It's just it's a kind of a formal exercise to have to go through the motions of it, because Chitanda is too trusting of people that she would never suspect, and she would never believe that Satoshi would do something like this. And it's something that also you see where it pushes Oreki to this place where he, I think, really hates having to deceive her. And so a lot of like the way that he like talks about it to Satoshi is also about like, I mean, you did all this and you are also getting Chitanda wrapped up in it. And I think it shows you how much he thinks about her, how much he cares about her and her feelings. And that's part of what he takes offense at. It's not just that he's being a bastard to Mayaka. It's that also his bastardness is now, messing with Chitanda and her feelings and what's going on with her as well. But this is where, you just push the Satoshi character to a really dark place, but a place that I think makes sense. Like, you have seen this kind of darker side to him as a person repeatedly, especially in the cultural festival arc, where you've seen how desperately he wants to be someone who is like special, but is also deeply afraid of actually pursuing that, because he's afraid of the answer to that being that, he's just, as he likes to say, a database and databases don't come to conclusions, right? He knows a lot of stuff, but he can't do anything with it. And that the natural sort of like conclusion of all of that is that like he has to be this kind of static person where everything washes off his back and he can't become emotionally invested. And that means that he can't respond to how Mayaka feels, even though clearly he does like her as well. And it leads to this fantastic climax on the bridge with the snow, where Oreki like gets up in his face and says like, I'm gonna have to fucking punch you, which is like the most non-Oreki thing in the world. But I love that whole sequence and how far it pushes all these characters, and ultimately to Satoshi. You have this great image of him calling Mayaka on the phone under a street lamp at night, where he's kind of finally realized it's time for him to take the plunge. Just a fantastic story that really pushes these characters into interesting places.
Absolutely. And two thoughts on that. That scene on the bridge is full of striking visuals. One thing that's funny is the Funimation, now Crunchyroll Blu-ray set I have of this show has on each of the discs like a kind of silhouette of an image from one of the episodes on that disc. And for this last disc, it has a silhouette of Oreki like grabbing Satoshi by the scruff of the neck like he does in this episode. And I remember when I was first watching the show and I looked at that disc, I went, why would that happen? I was like, that seems out of character for everyone. And by the time you get there, they've done the groundwork to make it feel earned, but it is still it's still meant to be kind of shocking, because it's a big move for both of these characters. But I think it's really, really well done and powerful. And it is kind of a rehearsal for what we're going to do in the finale, because both of the boys in the story effectively have a similar conclusion, which is that they have realized kind of their own character deficiency that is holding them back from happiness, and they have chosen to take the step of addressing it. And that is what we see with Satoshi at the end when he gets on the phone, and I think we can infer that he's going to be coming clean to Mayaka and having some kind of honest conversation. And that doesn't mean they're going to be a lovey-dovey couple the next day, but it means that he is on the path to, at a minimum, becoming a better, happier person. And that is also the ending we get in episode 22, which I think is pretty bold when you do it for the main character. And I know there's been, because I was looking it up last night, debate on this over the years of the ending of Hyouka. And I guess we should just jump right into talking about episode 22, because I think the point it ends on is tremendously beautiful. And it is, I think, very similar to like the ending of Haruhi, in the sense of, there is more source material. Even if there wasn't more source material, you can imagine more stories to tell in this universe. But you can also feel this team getting to a point in the story where they're a quit while they're ahead kind of storytelling team. And this is the resolution. And this is the right place to leave us off. And it feels very right to me, too.
Yeah, I mean, this is the best directed episode of the whole thing. Of the show, because this is the one where, if I go back to my full library, I took 149 screenshots just of episode 22. Yes. I took an endless 8 episodes worth of screenshots, because endless 8, I did that where I kind of took screenshots of every major scene. And I kind of did that for this one for my notes, because when I went through it, this episode is perfect.
Yes.
it's just incredible. So this one is obviously directed by Takemoto Yasuhiro with also Ishidate Taichi. So they kind of both tackled this episode, which I think kind of makes sense because there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of really complicated visuals, especially when you get to near the end of it. And specifically, I wanted to confirm this. Yeah, so it's Takemoto Yasuhiro is the only person actually credited for storyboards. It is him and Ishidate Taichi are both credited for Inshitsu, which is the direction credit. So they're co-directed. Takemoto Yasuhiro did the storyboards. So yeah, this whole episode, there's so many things that are fascinating about it. One is just the whole plot is not a mystery plot, really. I mean, there is technically a mystery in there of like who was the person who fucked up with the bridge thing, but that's not actually a mystery. They both solve that mystery in seconds. So it's by far the most different episode in terms of genre because this is just a slice of life episode. There's no kind of really Hyouka-ness to it in that way. It's obviously Hyouka-esque in that, like, we're really driving home our characters here and driving towards a conclusion point for them. But I love how it pushes Oreki into such uncomfortable space for him, right? If the happiest he has ever been was him just getting to sit up in the club room with nobody there during the culture festival, this is him the most out of his element. And I love the way they do this, where he gets called in to this weird little kind of hinamatsuri or like doll festival parade thing that they do where they need another person to hold one of the umbrellas. And so Chitanda calls him up and he ends up going up here and he goes into this building. There's all these scenes set in this uncomfortably small little room with all these old dudes in there who have clearly been doing this for fucking decades. And there's all these like pre-existing relationships between them that Oreki doesn't know who any of these people are or anything that's going on. And he's just sort of sitting in the corner by this little like space heater, this little kind of stove heater thing, is just trying to keep warm while all this other drama is going around. And it's like the mood and tone of that, I feel like I've never seen a piece of media capture that feeling of you being roped into some event that you're only like ancillarily connected to, right? It's like I'm not really responsible for this thing. I don't really know what this thing is, but I just have to be here to do something specific. And definitely, like, there were like a few times when I was younger, there've been a few times as a teacher where that has happened, where there's some kind of community thing that you just end up through some weird circumstances. You're there and you're just like, don't ask me about anything. I don't know anything. I'm just gonna hold the fucking umbrella. And just, that's it. And I love that whole mood in that room. And all these old guys, all of whom are voiced by like different great classic voice actors, which we'll run down some of that later real quick. But you have all that shit and all that drama. That then leads into them doing the whole festival procession. This just incredible sequence where I'm not even sure how quite to describe what they do, where the sort of image becomes blurred or like kind of blown out to a certain extent, and then it's effectively kind of in slow motion, but it's very framey, right? So you see like each individual frame, and they let all these frames overlap on each other to create this very kind of like surreal sense of time moving in this way that doesn't make sense, where time both feels like it's moving slowly and moving quickly at the same time as you go through this festival. And Oreki is just kind of enchanted by what's happened here. They get taken underneath the sakura trees, which normally this festival would not have gone under. And then that leads into the whole ending sequence where there's two long conversations between Oreki and Chitanda about solving the quote-unquote mystery, and then them talking about like where the future is going to lead them. But it is, it's such a fascinating episode because like none of that feels like a plot for Hyouka. Like none of it's not similar to the plots of the previous episodes. And it's so bold to me to like, for the last episode, to go for something that's so different. I love it. I can definitely see why some elements of this ending some people might not like, but I think it's one of the most like thought-provoking and interesting endings to a show of this style I've ever seen.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It might be the most strikingly animated single episode of TV I've ever seen, because everything, particularly in that second half, is just, calling it movie quality doesn't do it justice, because most movies don't get to this level of just absolutely insane production that they are doing with, as you say, the kind of high contrast, blown out look, it's kind of like a shutter stop effect they're doing where it's a frame rate play, but also the shutter speed is different on how they're doing the frames. It's emulating some things from real photography, but the lighting and the color work and everything, it's tremendous. It's out of this world. And I also think it is a very precise, good way to kind of wrap up this story and think about Hotaro's journey over this, course of this story, because it is about the way it is very clearly a Hyouka story. This is the furthest we've seen of a story of Hotaro going out of his comfort zone, which is what this entire show is about, right? From the moment he says at the beginning what his, silly motto is, this is a show about this kid going out of his comfort zone. And so you have that, and I think that you talked about like being roped in culturally to other events going on. I also just thought like, this is the classic doing something for your crush you never would do kind of episode. I did things like this in high school. No, we didn't have a hinamatsuri. We had other things that, you kind of prostrate yourself for in the name of love. And it's the kind of thing that will get him out of bed to do this in the morning. But then I think the final scene where they are walking past the cherry blossoms, and it complicates both characters in really interesting ways. Because you have Chitanda she speaks frankly to him here in a way that I don't think she's ever been this frank with him, right? Where you see that there is this kind of knowingly more serious side of her that we've got glimpses of before, but she's aware of her position in the world. She's aware of her own sort of limitations and very real skills. And she knows kind of what corner of the world she wants to inhabit. But you also see that, because of that, she is not as maybe inherently adventurous a person as he thought, and that maybe we thought. Because she has accepted to some degree that this town is her and her family's business. This is her corner of the world, and this is what she's going to inhabit. She does not have an uncertain future. And so that kind of changes the register of who she is a little bit. And I think that draws out in Oreki this idea of that he is a little bit more adventurous than he thought he was, and that he is more similar to this other side of Chitanda he had seen than he thought. And then the big play it makes is it has him make what would be in a lot of other shows be the climactic love confession, in him saying that, all that managerial stuff you said you couldn't do, maybe I could do it. And it's the big, oh my God, and then there's the wind comes in, and all the cherry blossoms fly past her hair, and it's like, what a beautiful confession of love. And then we come back to Earth, and that was a little fantasy he had. He doesn't wind up saying that, but he instead says, oh, it's getting chilly, isn't it? But then the wind happens anyway, and there's the big burst of wind that brings out the cherry blossoms and gets in her hair, and he sees her that way anyway, and she says, no, I think spring is soon. And they walk home together with the pink sky behind them. And I think it is such a beautiful representation of, he didn't actually say the thing that you want in your, traditional anime, for the big final confession. But that also would feel a little false for what this show is doing. Because that's already there. That light that she has brought into his life and that he has accepted is there. And the winter is effectively over. And that thaw is happening. And they can walk home together, and the future we don't get to see, but the path is really what matters, and they are on it. And I think that is such a beautiful, smart, challenging way to end the show. And it threw me for a little bit of a loop. I rewound the scene and just watched the whole thing again when it ended, because I was like, I kind of want to wrap my head around what they're doing. But, I loved it, and I just kind of sat there and stared at the wall for half an hour after this ended, because I was kind of blown over by this.
Yeah, this ending has always stuck with me a lot since I originally watched the show. I think because there's so much that goes unspoken between the two characters. There's something about the way that Chitanda lays out her whole thing of that eventually I'm going to come back here, right? I know that this is where my path leads me. And the way in which she says it sounds like she's breaking up with him, right? Because it sounds like, I think she knows that Oreki is this incredible person who has this these incredible abilities, and he's so interesting. He's so unique. He can do things that most people can't do. And I think she thinks that this is probably going to take him away from her. And I think she's like trying to kind of tell him that to a certain extent, but doesn't know how to do it, or doesn't know if that's like really the future that will bring, or if that's what she wants. But it kind of feels like that's what she's laying out, is that like they're heading in different paths. She's taking the science course, he's taking the literature course. This is also, so a lot of this conversation is also metaphorically like, or symbolically behind it. They are passing cross in front of where that bridge is that has been shut down. And on that bridge, there's a big sign that in Japanese just says no crossing, basically. And then two little construction thingies that say Anzen Daiichi, which is like, safety first, which I think like metaphorically is this like, they can't cross this bridge, whatever, like kind of divide between them. They can't cross, like, because they're both trying to be safe, right? Like, especially for like Oreki, like for him to have, if he actually said the thing at the end of the episode, that would be putting himself so far out on a limb. That is the opposite of safety first for someone of his like mental attitude. So you have that, and it's like, so that's what like kind of adds this kind of slightly darker, like very melancholy quality to the scene. That's also, I think, the fact that it's set in that first thaw where you both have snow is on the ground, but it's this kind of beautiful spring weather, and you've got, the sakura trees have come in, but all the other trees are still dead basically from winter. They haven't full like bloomed yet. And so you have this very kind of interesting liminal imagery where it's kind of winter, it's kind of spring. It kind of feels like they're coming together, and yet it also feels like they're coming apart. And then that's what leads into the scene where he imagines himself giving the big confession and them having the big spring moment. And it was just him imagining it. He has a flash to Satoshi from the previous episode that gives you that overlay of, yes, this is the same fundamental problem Satoshi has and why he was not able to cross that. And Oreki is in the same place, and he kind of chickens out. But then that wind comes anyways, as you said, and she tells him that no, spring is coming. And I find it very interesting. They show you again the image of the no crossing on the bridge, but now you have cherry blossom petals are sort of like spilling across it. And then the last shot is this shot. This is another one where they do a good little bit with depth of field, where they have, it's their feet in the bike with focus on that. And then focus pulls up in front of the camera where these little sprouts coming up that are new plants growing in that have not yet blossomed from spring. And that's when you get the title from the book, The Little Birds Can Remember. And yeah, it's so evocative of this feeling of like, this posturing of like, what does the future bring for these two young people? Like that, in some ways their paths are bringing them apart from each other. In some ways there's a divide between them that maybe they can't cross, but at the same time, there is something new that is beginning. Like spring is starting again. There's a new future ahead of them. There's a new year ahead of them, like new growth in front. And that I think like there's like that kind of hope that something will happen. But it's such a much more mature way of ending the story rather than your classic romantic, I confess, like, whatever, like, big confession you want to make, and, like, sort of leaving the viewer on this feeling of them being connected in this very defined, concrete, socially defined way as being in a romantic relationship. Whereas here, it is like you feel that they're heading towards each other, but they've got a lot of hurdles ahead. They've got a lot of boundaries ahead that they need to navigate and figure out how to cross, but that there is that, like, spring is starting again, and there's always that hope for them. It's just like, what a complicated emotional space to end the show on. That also is like ostensibly not, on the face of it, about these things. On the face of it, the show is about solving mysteries. But, the thing that this show truly sets up is this, interaction with Chitanda that brings Oreki slowly out of his shell, and how reluctant he is to do that. And he's been pulled out of that shell just the smallest amount to where he's decided to go do this thing. At the beginning of this series, he would not have gone to this fucking Living Doll Festival. He would have never done this, not in a million years. It took a year to get him to this point to have this conversation. And that also, I think Chitanda has a lot of things in her, considering her position, that also hold her back. It's not just Oreki. But, that scene of her entangling him in her hair, metaphorically, at the first episode, it culminates in this moment here. And that all that spring imagery does so as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's beautiful. And I think we've broken it down, but it's a tremendous ending to a tremendous show. One thing I want to say also is that this is a show whose, upper creative ranks were particularly hit hard by the Kyoto Animation arson attack. Takamoto Yasuhiro obviously was killed. Futoshi Nishiya, the character designer, was killed. The colorist, Ishida, I talked about earlier, was killed. Just a lot of the people who are most responsible for the beauty of this show were killed. And I think there is something about the open-heartedness and the empathy and the beauty that this show sees in the world in its complexity, taking it as it is and seeing possibility and potential in it, that just, as someone who, when the Kyoto Animation arson attack happened, I had not seen any of their work. I obviously found it horrifying, but I didn't have that sort of personal connection to it that I know a lot of anime fans did. And I think as we've gone through this season, obviously, the sadness of that has impacted me more and more. And I think this show, there was something about this show, and I think about, the number of people at the top ranks on this one that passed away, that just, I don't know, it really floored me thinking about the show last night in a way that I don't know if I'd sat down and contemplated it yet. And just, there's nothing really more to say. There's, you can't solve it, but boy, it hits hard. But also look at the mark these people left on the world in a show like this. This is a hell of a thing to leave behind.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. It's one of my favorite anime I've ever seen. It's definitely one of my favorite things for KyoAni, and that we've covered so far. I think will stay that way. And it's always been a particular favorite of mine because I do really like mystery stuff, in particular Sherlock Holmes, and so it's always really hit that side. But there's this whole other dimension to this show that episode 22 really brings out, that I agree. Like, it makes you think a little bit about what happened with the arson attack, and for the people who made this, because this ending is so artful and beautiful and complex and draws on so many different feelings, it really makes you introspective in a lot of ways.
So I think we have to wrap up here in a minute. Did you also just want to give a shout out to the insane list of guest stars they had on this show?
Yes. So let's run down some of the other people on the show, of just to kind of prove a point of how many great ones. I do want to briefly talk just a little bit more about the sister, because we didn't talk much about her, but she is like the best character of the show.
Oh, Oreki's sister, right?
Yeah. Oreki's older sister, Tomoe, who's voiced by Yukino Satsuki, who we talked about before. She's Misae, the dorm mother in Clannad. Oreki's sister is like the best. I love her whole, like, she's like, in the Sherlock Holmes sense, she's like Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's older brother, that she's like the true genius. She's the mastermind behind everything. I love her role in the show of just like poking at her doofy younger brother and like kind of getting him to do all these things as she's slowly manipulating him out to get him to grow. It's a great character. I love that you like never see her face, and like that whole kind of gimmick around the character. She also is like creates the frame devices for the novels. So like her letter to Oreki at the beginning is that's just like the first thing in the first novel, is just her letter to him, and that creates the frame, and then he writes a letter to her at the end. There is in the second novel, it's the chat room thing where that never even tells you that it's her, but you can read between the lines and know that Irisu was chatting with Oreki's older sister on that chat room, and that is what caused her to lock onto Hotaro and all that stuff, and that Oreki's sister is also kind of brutal, that she kind of pokes some thorns into Irisu senpai at the end, like kind of cutting through her bullshit of where she's being like, well, there's nothing else I could have done. Like, this is the only choice available to me. And I like that, Oreki's older sisters, she's out there looking out for him, but also causing a lot of like weird bullshit for him to deal with, and is a great character.
Absolutely.
Irisu senpai? You want to
No. I was just going to say, I do like the choice never to show her face. Yes. It is funny. It is the kind of thing that you could not do in the live-action version of this show, because it would be very awkward. But in this version, you can do it, and it becomes a running gag, and it's great. Love her.
Yeah, she's amazing. So that Irisa Senpai from the end credits of the Fool arc, she's voiced by Yukana. That's a great voice actress. She's in fucking everything. She's her big KyoAni connection. She's Testarossa, who's the ship captain in Full Metal Panic. So that's very good. And then we talked about already Koyama Mami's in it. Let's run down some of these other ones really quick. So Yotaro Okiayu is Togaishi Senpai, the guy who hotboxes in the room. That's also the dad from Clannad. I'm blanking on the love interest dad. I can't believe I'm forgetting her name, but there's a lot of names here. Koshimizu Ami is Midori Yamanishi. I don't remember which one that was, but she's one of the other characters. Tomokazu Sugita is there as the cooking club vice president, who you can tell that basically all of his lines are ad-libbed because he just throws in a bunch of random jokes. Like he quotes a line from Beyond the Time from Char's Counterattack, and I love it. You got to get Sugita in there somewhere. It's a KyoAni show. He's got to show up. Yuki Aoi is in here. She plays like 5 different characters, most notably the scriptwriter's friends. Noriaki Sugiyama, Sasuke from Naruto, is the guy with the water pistol.
Yes.
That's there. Unsho Ishizuka, he's one of the old dudes at the end. Minako Kotobuki, who is Tsumugi from K-On!, she's the Hatsune Miku cosplayer. Hayami Saudi is Jumonji Kaho, the Shrine Maiden girl. Ayane Taketatsu, who is Azusa from K-On!, she is one of the other manga club members. Junichi Suabe, Archer from Fate Stay Night, he's the orange-headed guy in the last episode. Minori Chihara, Nagato Yuki from Suzumi Haruhi, she's the girl who would have been the killer in the proper version of the video. Toshiki Morikawa, Leon S. Kennedy himself, is the student council president, who I think has 2 lines of dialogue in the whole thing. Yoko Hikasa, who is what's her name from the bass player, Mio from K-On!, she's the quiz presenter. Maria Issei, she's the girl who wants to make the video horror movie. Ito Hirohashi, who's Kyo in Clannad, she is one of the other girls in the movie. Fukuyama Jun is the student council vice president, which is hilarious because he is also he's the exact same character that he was in the Clannad OVA, who's like the dick to Tomiya and all that, and it's just funny to me. Shigeru Chiba is another one of the old guys in the last episode. We already talked about Toyosaki Aki. Is the older of the 2 sisters in the that one episode in the Ryokan episode.
Springs.
Yes, and then Ogura Yui, who's in a bunch of stuff. She's my favorite character in Love Live. She's the younger of the 2 sisters. And that's just some. There are other ones. I had to cut it off at a certain point. It is fucking ridiculous.
Episode 22 in particular just has this litany of like legends in the credits doing like 5 lines as the old men. It's amazing.
It's ridiculous. And again, like a lot of it is you've got a bunch of, returning KyoAni veterans from Clannad and K-On! In particular that show up here. But it's just top down. I think it's when Sugiyama Noriaki shows up as the gun dude. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? like he's just this. The thing is, because they're all such good actors, they're all so good. So, it's just ridiculous. It's crazy how many people are in the show in just little tiny roles.
It's wonderful. It's the KyoAni effect. Hyouka, we love you, but we have to move on, Sean, because this is the end of part 4 of our Kyoto Vacation. We're going to take a week off next week, and then we'll be back for part 5 on March 10th, where we will be talking about Chunibyo, which is 8th grader syndrome, but also other delusions. Yeah. Sean, you want to tell us about what part 5 is and where people can find these shows?
Yes. Well, part 5, I don't think we've talked about this on Japanimation Station itself. We've talked about it through other channels, but we have decided to expand our Kyoto Vacation. It's basically a Kyoto homestay at this point. The Kyoto, vacation
Kyoto exchange program.
Yes. We're staying here for a long time because there was a big gap between this part and our what was going to be originally our part 5. Now is part 6, which would cover Silent Voice and Hibike Euphonium. But we want to cover some of the gaps in between there. So we are starting now part 5 of our Kyoto Vacation, which is Kyoto Animation's Splendid Isolation, which is covering Kyoto Animation's transition into making either original anime or anime based on light novels that Kyoto Animation helped publish. So we'll kind of start telling that story and taking a look at how that all is going to work. So that's going to start with next time. We are looking at Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions, or Chunibyo Demo Koi ga Shitai, if you know it from the Japanese title. We're specifically looking just at season 1. So there are 2 seasons of that show, a recap movie and a finale movie. We're just looking at the original 12 episodes and the OVA that was made with the first season. And we're doing that next time. If you want to know where we're heading to be able to watch ahead or get stuff to be able to watch, the second episode of part 5 will be covering Tamako Market and Tamako Love Story, the movie, in one episode. Then we'll be doing Beyond the Boundary, the show and the OVA and the finale movie they made. And then the last episode for part 5 is going to be us covering Myriad Colors Phantom World, which is just a 13-episode show with an OVA. So if you want to know where we're going, that is the extra part that we're adding on here to bridge the gap between Hyouka and Silent Voice and Sound Euphonium. So next time on Kyoto Vacation, you want to start checking out that Love, that Chunibyo, and maybe some of those other delusions.